Welcome to Sleepy Time Stories. Hey dear friends, long before the United States appeared on any map, before the first European ships crossed the Atlantic, and before modern cities covered the land, something extraordinary was already here. Hidden beneath forests, buried under fields, and forgotten by time, ancient cities once stood across North America. Massive earthworks, mysterious settlements, and lost civilizations left behind clues that continue to challenge what we know about the past. Who built these forgotten cities? How did they organize thousands of people without modern technology? And why were some of these incredible places abandoned and swallowed by nature? Before starting the story, like and subscribe to my channel for more stories. Now start the story. Tonight, we journey deep into the shadows of history to uncover the forgotten worlds that existed before America was born. The ancient cities, mysterious civilizations, and lost stories waiting to be remembered. This is a journey into the past, where every discovery reveals that history is far older and far stranger than we ever imagined. Let's settle in and drift into a place where time moves slowly, and the echoes of ancient footsteps speak softly from the earth beneath us. There exists a telling of American history that set sail with a single ship, or rather, 3 of them, appearing on the far edge of the world in the year 1492. Those aboard believed they were bound for the shores of India, but instead, they stumbled upon a coastline they had never dared to dream of. They drove a flag into the soil and declared it a new world. Yet they called the people they found there by names that were never their own. They began to write the tale as though nothing of consequence had existed before that flag touched the ground. This version still lingers in textbooks, still lives in the minds of most people when they contemplate who was here first, what this land truly looked like, and what kinds of civilizations had risen, been set ablaze, abandoned, forgotten, and buried under layers of silence long before any European vessel cut across the western horizon. And this version, in ways that are profoundly important, is a falsehood. It is not a lie born of pure imagination, though some of that undoubtedly exists as well. Rather, it is a falsehood of omission, of skewed perspective, of arrogant dismissal, of willful minimization. It is a lie that transformed cities far grander than London into mere footnotes. It is a lie that recast sophisticated agricultural networks into untamed wilderness. It is a lie that stared upon the remnants of a great civilization and concluded that nothing worthy of memory had ever stood there. This is not that narrative. What you are about to hear is the story of what was genuinely present. Not the tidied, simplified, cozy account. Not the vague gesture toward Native Americans serving as mere backdrop in someone else's drama, but the true chronicle as meticulously as archaeology, anthropology, oral heritage, and sincere scholarship can piece it together, of the cities and cultures that filled this land for thousands of years before anyone in Europe was aware of its existence. We're going to walk through places that have been erased from our common recollection. We are going to discuss populations that have been consistently and systematically minimized. We are going to examine engineering feats that have been casually explained away. We are going to listen to the testimony that the very ground has been striving to share with us for centuries. Evidence that keeps surfacing no matter how many times it is reburied beneath the weight of the preferred account. If you are here to let the day slip away, then that is precisely why these stories are told. Perhaps you might like to subscribe and let me know where your thoughts are resting right now and what hour the clock shows. So, let us begin with a single, potent number, a number that, once it settles in your mind, brings clarity to everything else in this story in a way that nothing else can. In 1491, the year before Columbus set forth, the population of North America was not a few 100,000 scattered tribes existing lightly upon an endless, wild expanse. The most meticulous and honest scholarship we have today suggests that the population of the Americas, both North and South combined, was somewhere between 50 million and 100 million souls. Some estimates climb even higher. Some credible researchers place the figure at 112 million. 112 million people, in a world where the entire population of Europe at that same moment was roughly 70 million. This number is not a misprint. It is not an eccentric theory. It is the fruit of decades of dedicated demographic research by scholars such as Henry Dobbins, William Denevan, and Charles Mann, who devoted their careers to unraveling the devastating impact of epidemic disease from the census records and traveler journals produced by Europeans in the decades following contact. Because the crucial detail about those early European accounts, which described a landscape both sparse and desolate, is that they were penned after the plagues had already swept through. Smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, all of it moving inland faster than any European explorer could travel, decimating populations that had developed no immunity, reducing communities by 60, 70, sometimes 90% before a single white man ever set foot in a village to record what he observed. What the early explorers called wilderness was, in so many instances, the aftermath of catastrophe. Empty fields where crops had flourished, silent villages where thousands had dwelled, overgrown plazas that had once been centers of ceremony, forests slowly reclaiming streets that had been pathways. They gazed upon the ruins of a fallen civilization and named it nature. And then they sent their reports back to Europe, and those reports became the bedrock of the narrative we still tell. A story of a nearly vacant continent, sparsely inhabited by primitive peoples who had never constructed anything worth remembering, who had coexisted peacefully with an untouched wilderness now ripe for the taking. This story was not an accident. It was useful. It justified everything that came after, and it has proven remarkably resilient. But the ground has been fighting back for 200 years now. Every shovel that pierces the earth uncovers something that does not fit the narrative. Every scan, every satellite image, every analysis of soil chemistry, every careful reading of pollen cores, bone chemistry, and tree rings reveals the same truth over and over again. There was a world here, vast, intricate, populated, and interconnected. And what happened to it stands as one of the most profound tragedies in human history. Let us begin where most American history books refuse to start, which is not in 1492, but in the ice. 14,000 years ago, give or take a few centuries depending on which researcher you consult, the first human beings crossed into what is now North America. We once believed this happened in a single surge, the Clovis people, named for the distinctive projectile points first uncovered near Clovis, New Mexico, arriving via a land bridge from Siberia and spreading rapidly southward through an ice-free corridor between retreating glaciers. This story was neat and tidy. It had a clear beginning, a clear route of migration, and a clear date of arrival. It was taught in universities for most of the 20th century. It is also almost certainly incomplete at best, and incorrect in critical respects at worst. The difficulty is that sites keep appearing that predate the Clovis timeline. Monte Verde in Chile has been dated to at least 14,500 years ago, which indicates that people had already reached the southernmost tip of South America before the Clovis culture had even taken root in North America. You cannot journey to Patagonia without having spent a very long time getting there. The mathematics simply do not add up unless people arrive considerably earlier than the Clovis model permits. Sites in Texas, Oregon, and South Carolina suggest human presence pushing back to 15,000, 16,000, even 20,000 years ago. Some of this evidence remains debated, but the sheer volume of it has compelled a fundamental rethinking of the standard arrival story. The current best hypothesis is that the first Americans may have arrived in multiple waves, and that at least some of them came not through an inland corridor, but along the coast in boats, following the rich kelp forest ecosystem that would have provided sustenance all the way from Beringia to California and down to South America. Coastal sites from this period are notoriously difficult to find because sea levels have risen significantly since the Ice Age, drowning the shorelines where those early communities would have lived. This means we are searching for the origin story of American civilization in places that are now underwater. That is not merely a metaphor, though it certainly serves as one. Much of what we wish to understand about the deep past of this continent is hidden from us. Not because it did not exist, but because it lies in places we cannot easily reach, or because it was destroyed, or because the people who could have passed the story down were themselves destroyed before that transmission could take place. What we do know is that by 10,000 years ago, human beings had spread across the entire continent. By 8,000 years ago, they were beginning to settle into the regional patterns that would eventually produce the civilizations we are going to explore. By 5,000 years ago, there were already permanent settlements, already sophisticated food production systems, already trade networks stretching hundreds and then thousands of miles. And by 3,000 years ago, there were cities, not cities in the way Europeans use the word sometimes, not always cities with stone walls and written records and named kings, but cities in the sense that truly matters, densely populated, permanently settled, architecturally complex places where large numbers of people organized themselves into sophisticated social hierarchies, developed specialized labor, produced surplus food, built monuments, conducted trade, performed elaborate religious ceremonies, and passed their accumulated knowledge down through generations. Cities. There were cities here, many of them. Let us speak of the oldest one that most Americans have never heard of. The site is called Watson Break. It rests in the floodplain of the Washita River in northern Louisiana. And if you drove past it on the highway, you would scarcely notice it. You would see a series of low rises in the landscape, overgrown with grass and trees, not obviously different from the natural terrain around them. You might not even look twice, but those low rises are not natural. There are 11 earthen mounds arranged in an oval formation connected by ridges, the largest standing nearly 8 meters tall. And they were constructed by human hands approximately 5,500 years ago. 5,500 years ago. That is older than Stonehenge. That is roughly contemporary with the earliest phases of construction at the pyramids of Giza. That is centuries before the Olmec civilization began in Mexico, which used to be considered the mother culture of all American civilizations, the earliest complex society in the Western Hemisphere. Watson Break dismantled that assumption entirely when it was properly dated in the 1990s. Because if hunter-gatherers in Louisiana were building planned, geometrically arranged ceremonial complexes 5 millennia ago, then the story of how civilization developed in the Americas needs to be fundamentally rethought. And Watson Break was not alone. It was not even the largest complex of its kind. Roughly 1,000 years after Watson Break was built, another group of people, equally without agriculture in the conventional sense, began constructing an even more elaborate complex of earthen mounds about 90 miles to the east. This place is called Poverty Point, and it is one of the most significant and least discussed archaeological sites in North America. Poverty Point sits near the confluence of the Arkansas and Mississippi rivers, and what its builders created there between roughly 1700 and 1000 BCE is staggering in its scale and sophistication. 6 concentric, partially circular ridges, each about 2 meters high and between 20 and 40 meters wide, arranged in a pattern nearly 2 kilometers in diameter. These ridges are not natural formations. They are engineered earthworks, and the labor required to build them, moving an estimated 2 million cubic meters of earth using only hand tools and baskets, has been compared to the effort required to construct the Great Pyramid of Khufu. 2 million cubic meters of earth moved by hand, arranged in a precise geometric pattern by people who, according to the traditional story of American prehistory, were supposed to be simple hunter-gatherers, not yet capable of the kind of organized social complexity that monumental construction requires. The problem is that Watson Break and Poverty Point keep forcing archaeologists to confront a question that the standard narrative really does not want to answer. What if the relationship between civilization and agriculture is not as straightforward as we always assumed? What if complexity, monumentality, and social hierarchy can emerge from societies that are not farming in the traditional sense? Because the people of Watson Break and Poverty Point were not, as far as we can tell, dependent on cultivated crops. They were living in one of the most resource-rich environments in North America, the confluence zone of major river systems where fish, waterfowl, deer, nuts, tubers, and wild seeds were available in extraordinary abundance. They were managing that abundance. Certainly, they may have been cultivating some plants in ways we have not fully recognized yet, but they were not the settled agricultural villages that civilization was supposed to require. And yet there were the mounds, precisely placed, geometrically arranged, oriented toward astronomical features, requiring coordinated labor at a scale that implies organized leadership, communal decision-making, and a shared conceptual framework that persisted across generations. That is civilization, whatever we want to call the category. That is what it looks like. And Poverty Point was also a major trading center. Artifacts found there include copper from the Great Lakes, galena from Illinois, chert from the Ozarks, soapstone from the Appalachians, trade goods traveling hundreds of miles to reach a community in Louisiana, which means Poverty Point was not an isolated phenomenon. It was a node in a network connected to other communities, other systems, other places where people were building things and making things and moving things across a continent that was evidently already far more interconnected than anyone has been comfortable admitting. That network is going to become very important because the story of North American civilization before contact is more than anything else a story about connection, about how ideas and goods and peoples and practices moved across enormous distances, building on each other, influencing each other, creating something that was in aggregate far larger and more complex than any single site or culture or moment could suggest. But to understand the network, we need to understand its greatest node. We need to talk about the city that was for a brief and extraordinary period the largest urban center in North America. We need to talk about Cahokia. The city that archaeology now calls Cahokia occupied a broad plain at the confluence of the Mississippi, Missouri, and Illinois rivers, just east of where St. Louis, Missouri now stands. At its peak, roughly between 1050 and 1200 CE, it was home to between 10,000 and 20,000 people, with a greater metropolitan area, if we include the surrounding communities and subordinate towns, that may have housed as many as 120,000 people. 120,000 people in the middle of North America in the 11th century, at a time when the largest city in England was London, with a population of roughly 15,000. Cahokia was bigger than London. It was by some measures the largest city north of Mexico, until Philadelphia surpassed it in the 18th century, and almost nobody knows it exists. The site is now a state historic site in Illinois, stranded between a casino and a highway. Its most dramatic feature, the enormous earthwork now called Monk's Mound, rising 100 feet above the surrounding plain. Monk's Mound is the largest prehistoric earthen structure in the Americas. Its base covers 14 acres, which is actually larger than the base of the Great Pyramid of Giza. It required the movement of an estimated 22 million cubic feet of earth, carried in baskets on human backs, deposited in layers over the course of several centuries. On top of Monk's Mound stood a building roughly 100 feet long and 50 feet wide, framed in timber, plastered with clay, and roofed in thatch. This was almost certainly the residence and ceremonial center of Cahokia's paramount chief, the person or office at the apex of what was clearly a hierarchical, stratified, politically sophisticated society. Surrounding Monk's Mound at its base was a large open plaza covering nearly 50 acres, used for public gatherings, ceremonies, and a ritual game called Chunky, in which players threw stone discs and competed to predict where they would land. The chunky stone became a prestige object traded across thousands of miles, its presence at distant sites a marker of Cahokian cultural influence. Beyond the central plaza spread the rest of the city, residential neighborhoods arranged in distinct sectors, craft production areas where artisans worked copper, shell, and stone into the elaborate regalia that marked status in Cahokian society, warehouses for the storage and redistribution of agricultural surplus, charnel houses for the processing of the dead, and everywhere more mounds. At least 120 of them, possibly more, have been identified within the roughly 6 square miles of the Cahokia site proper. Mounds of varying sizes and shapes, used for different purposes, some residential, some ceremonial, some mortuary. The entire landscape was an engineered terrain, shaped and reshaped over centuries to express the cosmological and political vision of its builders. That vision was elaborate and sophisticated. Cahokia's builders oriented their city to the cardinal directions, and they tracked the movements of the sun and moon with a precision that allowed them to mark the solstices and equinoxes with wooden posts arranged in a circle archaeologists call woodhenge. Multiple iterations of this structure have been found at Cahokia, rebuilt and adjusted over time, suggesting that the astronomical calendar was not a static achievement, but an ongoing scientific project, refined through generations of observation. The religious system behind all of this, as best as we can reconstruct it from the material evidence and from the traditions of descendant peoples, centered on a cosmology in which the world was divided into upper, middle, and lower realms, connected by a central axis represented physically by the Great Mound itself. The paramount chief was understood to be a mediating figure between these realms, a sacred person whose physical body was identified with the cosmic axis, whose health and power maintained the order of the world. We know this in part because of what archaeologists found when they excavated one of Cahokia's burial mounds, the site designated Mound 72. What they found there was extraordinary and disturbing in equal measure. Mound 72 was a relatively small ridgetop mound, but its contents were unlike anything else at the site. At its center, the burial of a high-status individual, a man in his 40s, laid out on a platform of more than 20,000 shell beads, arranged in the shape of a bird, which may have been a falcon, a figure of great importance in Mississippian cosmology, associated with the upper world, with warfare, and with chiefly power. Around this central burial were dozens of other burials, some clearly sacrificial, young women, their skeletons showing no signs of disease or violence except the circumstances of death itself, arranged in carefully organized groupings. The excavators counted more than 250 individuals in Mound 72 in total, many of them clearly sacrificed to accompany this important person into whatever afterlife Cahokia's belief system described. Human sacrifice on this scale implies a level of hierarchical power that is genuinely startling. It means that whoever held the position of paramount chief at Cahokia had authority so absolute that the deaths of hundreds of people could be commanded to serve the ritual requirements of a single individual's burial. That is not a chiefdom in the loose sense the word is sometimes used. That is a state, or something very close to it. And there is something else about Cahokia that does not get enough attention. The city appears to have risen extraordinarily rapidly in the decades around 1050 CE, in what archaeologists call the Big Bang of Cahokia. The site went from a modest collection of villages to a full urban complex in what seems by archaeological standards like an almost impossibly short time. Monk's Mound was enlarged rapidly. The central plaza was cleared and leveled. A massive palisade wall was constructed, enclosing the central precinct, and the population surged. Something happened around 1050 that triggered this explosion of construction and social organization. We do not know exactly what it was. Some researchers have pointed to a spectacular solar event visible from North America around that time. Others have suggested a charismatic religious or political leader whose vision transformed the social landscape. Others have looked at climate data, showing an extended warm period that would have made agriculture in the region unusually productive, creating the surplus that funded the construction boom. Whatever the cause, Cahokia in its prime was genuinely extraordinary. Its influence radiated outward across an enormous territory. Trade goods from Cahokia have been found as far away as the Gulf Coast, the Great Plains, and the Upper Great Lakes. Cahokian-style pottery, figurines, and iconography appear at sites hundreds of miles from the city. Communities that adopted Cahokian religious symbols, political models, and cultural practices stretch from Wisconsin to Oklahoma to North Carolina. This was not a city in isolation. This was a metropolis at the center of a civilization. And then it declined. By 1300 CE, Cahokia's population had dropped sharply. By 1350, the site appears to have been largely or entirely abandoned. The Great Palisade fell. The temple buildings on Monk's Mound were dismantled or burned. The smaller mounds were no longer maintained. The city that had once housed over 100,000 people in its extended sphere fell silent. Why? This is one of the great unsolved questions in North American archaeology. The theories are multiple and probably mutually reinforcing. Climate change is one factor. The warm period that had made Cahokia's agriculture so productive ended, replaced by a colder, drier regime that would have stressed the city's food supply. Political instability is another. Any highly centralized, hierarchical polity is vulnerable to the inevitable conflict over succession and the resentment of subordinate communities. Environmental degradation is a third, because a city of tens of thousands of people requires enormous amounts of timber for construction and firewood, and the deforestation of the surrounding region would have destabilized soils, contributed to flooding, and ultimately undermined the agricultural base that supported the city. There is also a disturbing possibility that the human sacrifice and the coercive power it represents may have generated enough social tension to eventually fracture the political order. Cahokia was not a voluntary community. It was a place of enormous inequality, where a tiny elite commanded the labor, the bodies, and sometimes the lives of everyone else. Systems like that generate resistance, and when the environmental stresses arrived, that resistance may have found its moment. But here is what did not happen. The people did not vanish. The cultures that had developed at and around Cahokia did not simply disappear. They dispersed. They moved. They carried the ideas, the artistic traditions, the cosmological frameworks, the agricultural practices, and the social structures of Cahokian civilization into new communities in new places. The descendants of the people of Cahokia are with high probability among the peoples that European explorers encountered centuries later, and described in their journals in ways that made almost no reference to the elaborate civilization from which those peoples had descended. The Osage, the Quapaw, the Chickasaw, the Natchez, all of them carry in their oral traditions and their ceremonial practices echoes of a civilization that European scholarship refused to recognize as such. And the land where Cahokia stood is now suburban Illinois, cut through by highways, encroached upon by commercial development, and known to most of the people who drive past it, if they notice it at all, only as a curious lump in the landscape that someone once built a monastery on. Hence the name Monk's Mound, the largest pre-Columbian city north of Mexico, bigger than contemporary London, the center of a civilization that influenced communities across half a continent. A footnote in most American history textbooks. But Cahokia is not the only story. It is not even the only city. Let us move west. Let us move into the desert southwest, where a civilization rose that was in its own way no less significant, and whose physical traces are in some respects even more dramatic. The people modern scholars call the ancestral Puebloans, and whom older scholarship called the Anasazi, a Navajo word meaning something roughly like ancient enemy, a term the descendants of these people find offensive and inaccurate, built their civilization in one of the most hostile environments on the continent. The Colorado Plateau, that vast region of canyon-cut sandstone and high desert that spans parts of what are now Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico, is not an environment that seems designed to support a large and sophisticated population. The annual rainfall is low and erratic. The growing season is short. The terrain is dramatic, but difficult. Water is scarce, precious, and unpredictable. And yet from roughly 800 CE to about 1300 CE, a civilization flourished here that built architectural works so sophisticated, so precisely engineered, so oriented to astronomical and cosmological principles, that they rank among the most extraordinary achievements of any pre-industrial culture anywhere in the world. The most famous of these works are the cliff dwellings. Mesa Verde in Colorado, Cliff Palace in particular, is probably the image most people carry when they think about ancient American architecture, if they think about it at all. A structure of more than 150 rooms and 23 kivas built into a natural alcove in the canyon wall, connected by plazas and passageways, rising in some places 4 stories. It housed perhaps 125 people at its peak. It was built with a precision that still impresses structural engineers, using sandstone blocks cut and shaped to fit together with minimal mortar, the walls plumb and true, the rooms proportioned with evident care. But Cliff Palace, magnificent as it is, was not the center of ancestral Puebloan civilization. To find that center, we need to go to Chaco Canyon in northwestern New Mexico. Chaco Canyon is a place that defies easy description. It is an 11-mile stretch of high desert canyon cut through pale sandstone, receiving less than 9 inches of rain per year, baked by summer sun and scoured by winter wind. It does not look on first glance like a place where anything extraordinary would happen, but between roughly 850 and 1150 CE, the people of Chaco built here something that archaeologists have been struggling to fully comprehend ever since they first excavated it in the 19th century. They built, first of all, the great houses, multi-story, multi-room stone masonry structures of a scale and architectural sophistication that was not matched again in North America until the 19th century. Pueblo Bonito, the largest of the Chaco great houses, is a D-shaped structure covering more than 2 acres of ground floor, rising 4 and in some places 5 stories, containing approximately 800 rooms arranged around a central plaza. Its walls were built of carefully shaped sandstone blocks, filled with a rubble core, faced with a precision masonry of small, shaped stones laid in distinctive patterns that are considered by archaeologists to be aesthetically extraordinary, as well as structurally sophisticated. The ceilings of Pueblo Bonito's rooms were held up by timber beams. And here is something important. The timber came from forests that were at minimum 50 miles away, and in some cases far more distant. Ponderosa pine from the Chusca Mountains, spruce and fir from the mountains to the north and east. 200,000 timbers, or something close to it, were transported to Chaco Canyon almost certainly on human backs from forests many miles distant. 200,000 timbers carried by hand into a desert canyon to build buildings that did not need to be that large or that elaborate for purely functional reasons. This was not just architecture. This was a statement, a deliberate, costly, organized statement about power, vision, and cosmological meaning. And the great houses were not the only statement Chaco's builders made. They also built roads. The Chaco road system is one of the most perplexing and underappreciated engineering achievements in North American prehistory, radiating outward from Chaco Canyon in multiple directions. These roads are straight, perfectly uncompromisingly straight, engineered to run in direct lines regardless of the terrain, cutting through hills rather than going around them, dropping down cliffs on staircases of cut stone rather than finding a gentler route. They are also in most places about 9 meters wide, far wider than any practical transportation need would require, given that ancestral Puebloans had no wheeled vehicles and no large domesticated animals. The roads extend for hundreds of miles. The full extent of the Chaco road system is still not completely mapped, but what has been documented connects Chaco Canyon to a network of what archaeologists call outliers, smaller great house communities scattered across a region the size of New England. Why straight? Why 9 meters wide? The best current thinking is that the roads served primarily ritual rather than practical transportation functions, that they were processional ways, routes along which pilgrims traveled to Chaco for periodic gatherings, marked by the straightness and width that conveyed cosmological meaning in ancestral Puebloan thought. The roads point in many cases toward significant astronomical features on the horizon. Some of them align precisely with the positions of the sun at solstices or equinoxes, or with the positions of the moon at its major standstill points. Chaco Canyon was, it appears, a ceremonial center of enormous regional significance, not primarily a place where people lived permanently in large numbers, though some did, but a place where people came from across a vast region to participate in ceremonies, to renew social and political ties, to trade, to observe the astronomical events that the canyon's architecture was designed to mark. The astronomical sophistication of Chaco's builders deserves its own moment here, because it is genuinely striking. Fajada Butte, a prominent rock formation at the mouth of Chaco Canyon, holds one of the most elegant examples of astronomical alignment ever documented anywhere in the world. On its south face, 3 large stone slabs lean against the cliff in a configuration that was for a long time assumed to be natural. In 1977, an artist named Anna Sofar noticed that on the summer solstice at solar noon, a dagger of sunlight passed precisely through the center of a spiral petroglyph carved on the rock face behind the slabs. Further investigation revealed that on the winter solstice, 2 daggers of light framed the spiral on either side, and on the equinoxes, a single dagger bisects a second smaller spiral. This is not an accident. This is a deliberately engineered astronomical instrument, built into a natural-seeming configuration of rock, calibrated to mark the 4 most significant points in the solar year with a precision that required extensive observation and sophisticated understanding of celestial motion. Similar alignments appear throughout Chaco Canyon itself. Great house walls, oriented to mark solstice and equinox, sunrise and sunset, doorways and windows positioned to allow specific shafts of light to fall on specific features at specific times of year. The entire built environment of Chaco Canyon was in some sense a giant astronomical instrument, designed to keep its inhabitants in precise temporal relationship with the movements of the sun and moon. And this mattered enormously for the practical business of life in this environment. In a region where growing seasons were short and rainfall unpredictable, knowing exactly when to plant, when to harvest, when to store, and when to redistribute was the difference between survival and starvation. The astronomical knowledge encoded in Chaco's architecture was not abstract or purely religious. It was the most practical possible kind of knowledge. But the sophistication of Chaco goes even deeper than the architecture and the astronomy. The pottery produced in the Chaco region during this period, the black-on-white ceramics that have been found in museum collections around the world, is some of the most technically accomplished and aesthetically complex ceramic work produced anywhere in the pre-industrial world. The geometric patterns that cover these vessels are not random decoration. They encode cosmological knowledge, clan identities, and ceremonial information in a visual language whose full meanings have been partially recovered through the traditions of descendant Pueblo peoples. And the trade networks that Chaco was embedded in were extraordinary in their extent. Macaws, the brilliant red and green parrots whose feathers were essential in ancestral Puebloan ceremony, were bred at Pacoima in Chihuahua, hundreds of miles to the south, and traded north to Chaco. Copper bells from Mexican workshops, cacao from Mesoamerica, turquoise from mines in New Mexico and Colorado, shell from the Gulf Coast and the Pacific, obsidian from volcanic sources in Utah and New Mexico. All of these moved through Chaco and through the network of which it was the center. cacao, chocolate, in a canyon in the high desert of New Mexico 1,000 years ago, traded up from Mesoamerica through a network of relationships whose complexity we have only begun to understand. This was not isolation. This was connection. Chaco was one node in a continental network of exchange, of ideas, of power, of religion, of art. And the people who built and inhabited it were not, as they have sometimes been described, simple desert dwellers eking out a marginal existence. They were sophisticated, technically accomplished, intellectually impressive, and deeply embedded in relationships that stretched from central Mexico to the Great Plains to the Pacific coast. And then, like Cahokia, Chaco was largely abandoned. By the mid-1100s, construction had slowed dramatically. By 1150, the great rooms of Pueblo Bonito were being filled with trash, which is an archaeologist's way of knowing that a building is no longer being maintained or inhabited. By 1200, the canyon was essentially empty of its peak population. Climate data tells part of the story. The 1130s brought a severe and extended drought to the Colorado Plateau, one of the worst in several centuries. Without adequate rainfall, the agricultural system that supported Chaco's regional network would have collapsed. Communities that had depended on Chaco for redistribution of surplus food during bad years found themselves with nothing to redistribute. But there is also evidence that the social system itself had become unsustainable in ways that went beyond climate. The hierarchy of Chaco was steep and extractive. The labor required to maintain the ceremonial calendar, to bring timber from distant forests, to feed the permanent population of Chaco and the periodic influxes of pilgrims, was immense. That labor fell disproportionately on subordinate communities. And there are signs in the archaeological record that those communities began to resist, that the roads and outlier system became less functional, that some communities began building their own independent ceremonial structures rather than continuing to orient themselves toward the canyon. When the drought came, a system already under strain broke. But again, the people did not disappear. They moved, reconfigured, built new communities in new places, often in the more defensible cliff sites that became characteristic of the late ancestral Puebloan period. They carried their knowledge, their traditions, their architectural skills, their astronomical understanding, their ceramic arts, their ceremonial systems into new contexts. Their descendants are the Pueblo peoples of the Rio Grande Valley and the Hopi and Zuni of Arizona, who still live in places they have inhabited continuously since before European contact, who still perform ceremonies whose forms reach back to Chaco and before, who still speak languages and maintain traditions that are direct continuations of the civilization that built those extraordinary structures in the high desert. The Hopi people do not consider what happened at Chaco to be a mystery or a collapse. Their oral traditions describe it as a dispersal, a moment when the people spread out as the Creator intended, carrying the accumulated wisdom of that great gathering place into new homes across the landscape. That is a different kind of story than the archaeologists tell. It is not incompatible with what the physical evidence shows, but it centers the people themselves rather than the ruins, and it insists on continuity where the standard narrative sees only disappearance. That insistence on continuity is something we are going to return to repeatedly in this story, because one of the most persistent and damaging myths in American prehistory is the myth of the vanished civilization. The idea that the great cultures of pre-contact America collapsed, disappeared, left only ruins and mysteries, and are now accessible to us only through archaeological detective work, rather than through the living knowledge of the peoples who are their direct descendants. That myth is wrong. It is also convenient, because a vanished civilization does not have descendants who can make legal and moral claims based on their ancestors' relationship to the land. A living civilization, continued in the traditions and sovereignty of actual existing peoples, is a much more complicated proposition. Let us hold that thought, and let us keep moving, Because while Cahokia was rising in the Mississippi Valley and Chaco was orchestrating its astronomical ceremonies in the desert southwest, something else was happening in the eastern woodlands, in the river valleys of the Ohio Valley and the broader region that is now Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, and surrounding states. Something extraordinary, something that predated Cahokia by nearly 1,000 years. Something that covered a landscape the size of New England, with one of the most extraordinary geometric earthwork complexes ever constructed by human hands. The Hopewell people. Let us talk about them. The term Hopewell refers not to a single culture or a single people, but to a shared ceremonial tradition that flourished in eastern North America from roughly 100 BCE to 500 CE. The people who participated in this tradition lived in communities scattered across a vast territory, spoke different languages, had somewhat different material cultures, and maintained distinct local identities. What they shared was a ceremonial complex of extraordinary sophistication, centered on burial practices of unusual richness and connected by trade networks of astonishing reach. The physical centerpiece of the Hopewell world was the earthwork complexes of the Scioto River Valley in what is now south-central Ohio. These complexes are so large and so geometrically precise that when 18th century surveyors first began to map them systematically, they initially refused to believe they were man-made. The Newark earthworks, spread across what is now the town of Newark, Ohio, were the largest single complex of geometric earthworks ever built anywhere on Earth. The original complex covered an area of more than 4 square miles. It included a great circle whose interior diameter was nearly 1,200 feet, enclosed by a wall standing perhaps 14 feet high. It included an octagon enclosing 50 acres whose 8 corners aligned precisely with the 8 positions of the moonrise and moonset at its major and minor standstills over its 18.6-year cycle. It included a smaller circle, and all of these were connected by walled avenues running for miles across the landscape. The lunar alignments of the Newark octagon are among the most precise astronomical achievements of any pre-modern civilization anywhere. The Hopewell builders tracked the complex cycle of the moon across its 18.6-year period, identified the 8 positions of moonrise and moonset at the turning points of that cycle, and then build a geometric structure that incorporated all 8 of those alignments simultaneously. This is not accidental. This requires extended, systematic, sophisticated observation of lunar motion over multiple years. It requires the mathematical ability to define a regular octagon precisely enough that the alignments work. It requires engineering ability to lay out that octagon accurately across a landscape that is not flat, accounting for terrain variation. It is an astonishing achievement, and the Great Hopewell Road, a set of parallel earthen walls 45 miles long, connected the Newark complex to the Chillicothe complex at Mound City, suggesting that these 2 great centers were understood as part of a single unified sacred landscape. The burial mounds associated with the Hopewell tradition are equally extraordinary. The goods placed in them reveal the trade network that archaeologists call the Hopewell interaction sphere, and that name understates what it was. Objects buried with Hopewell dead include obsidian from Yellowstone, more than 1,000 miles away, copper from the Lake Superior region, worked into elaborate headdresses, breastplates, and ceremonial objects, mica from the southern Appalachians, cut into silhouettes of hands, serpents, and human figures, shark teeth from the Gulf of Mexico, grizzly bear teeth from the Rocky Mountains, alligator skulls, freshwater pearls by the thousands, meteoric iron. These objects moved along trade routes that connected communities from the Rocky Mountains to the Atlantic coast, from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. The Hopewell interaction sphere was in effect a continental economic and ceremonial network, maintained not by political coercion, but by shared religious practice and the mutual benefits of exchange. And the craftsmanship of the objects produced in this tradition is frankly breathtaking. Hopewell copper workers used a repoussé technique, hammering sheet copper over molds to create three-dimensional forms, producing objects of extraordinary delicacy and beauty. Hopewell stone workers produced blades of Yellowstone obsidian so thin and precisely knapped that they appear almost translucent, with the quality of finished art objects rather than utilitarian tools. Hopewell artists cut mica into complex silhouette forms depicting hands, serpents' claws, and human figures with a precision that is extraordinary given the fragility of the material. This was not a culture on the margins of civilization. This was a culture at the center of its own world, producing art of genuine beauty and maintaining social connections across an entire continent. And then around 500 CE, the Hopewell tradition faded. The mound building slowed and stopped. The long-distance trade in exotic goods declined sharply. The elaborate burial ritual that had been the centerpiece of the tradition ceased. Why? The honest answer is that we do not fully know. Climate change has been proposed, as it usually is. Political instability, the disruption of the trade networks by some event or process that we cannot see clearly in the archaeological record. Some researchers have suggested that the tradition may have become a victim of its own success, that the enormous investment in mortuary ritual and long-distance trade eventually became unsustainable as communities grew and the demands of maintaining the ceremonial system grew with them. What we do know is that the people of the Hopewell tradition, like the people of Chaco and Cahokia, did not simply vanish. They continued. They adapted. The mound-building tradition that would eventually flower into Cahokia has roots in the Hopewell tradition. The people of the Midwest and East who European explorers encountered centuries later were the descendants of Hopewell communities, carrying in their traditions and their DNA the legacy of those extraordinary geometric earthworks and that continental trade network. And many of those earthworks still exist, though far fewer than once did. The Newark earthworks were partly preserved, partly destroyed, partly converted into a golf course, which is perhaps the most American possible fate for an ancient astronomical monument. The Great Octagon survives, though it too is used as a golf course for most of the year, its precise lunar alignments obscured by the grass and sand traps of the Mound Builders Country Club. That is where we are with North American prehistoric civilizations in popular consciousness. Precision lunar calendars turned into golf courses. Cities larger than London reduced to highway rest stops. The greatest concentrations of human engineering achievement on the continent described, when they are described at all, as curiosities. Let us move now to a different kind of story. Let us talk about the coast. Let us talk about the Pacific Northwest, where a civilization rose that operated on entirely different principles from the agricultural and mound-building cultures of the interior, and that produced in its own way a level of social complexity and material achievement that rivals anything we have discussed. The indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest coast, from what is now Northern California through Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, and into Alaska, developed what may be the most thoroughly documented example in the world of a complex hierarchical civilization that was not based on agriculture. The environment made this possible. The Pacific Northwest coast is one of the most biologically productive environments on the planet. The cold, nutrient-rich waters of the Pacific supported runs of salmon so vast that early European observers described the rivers as literally thick with fish during the summer spawning seasons. Halibut, herring, eulachon, sea mammals, shellfish, and the rich foods of the old-growth forests supplemented the salmon in a caloric abundance that would have seemed almost impossibly generous compared to the environments inhabited by most other cultures we have discussed. This abundance permitted permanent, densely settled villages. It permitted specialization in which different communities and different individuals focused on particular craft skills, allowing the development of extraordinary levels of technical accomplishment. It permitted the accumulation of surplus wealth and the social systems that grew up around the management and display of that wealth. The result was a culture complex that produced, among other things, the most architecturally sophisticated wooden structures built anywhere in the pre-industrial world, organized around a ceremonial economy of gift exchange and competitive generosity that baffled and fascinated European observers, and expressed its values and its cosmology in an art tradition of such originality and technical mastery that it is now recognized as one of the great art styles of world civilization. The largest plank houses were structures 60 feet wide and 120 feet long or more, their frameworks of massive timbers precisely notched and fitted together, their walls and roofs of split cedar planks. These were not simple shelters. They were engineered buildings, carefully designed to manage the coastal climate, to provide adequate light and ventilation, to accommodate the dozens of family groups that would have lived together in them, and to serve as the setting for the elaborate ceremonial life that was central to Northwest Coast culture. The totem poles and other carved wooden objects that Northwest Coast artists produced are some of the most recognizable artifacts of any indigenous culture, but they are often fundamentally misunderstood by the people who encounter them in museums. The carved figures on a totem pole are not idols or religious objects in the simple sense. They are text. They are records. They tell the stories of the house group that owns them, recording the lineage, the relationships, the significant events, and the relationships with supernatural beings that define that group's identity and status. In a culture without writing, this visual storytelling tradition served some of the same functions that written records serve in literate cultures. It preserved history, established legal claims to rights and territories, and communicated social and political information across the community and to visitors who encountered the poles at the entrances of village houses. The art tradition that produced these poles is recognizable for its distinctive formal principles. The figures depicted are shown simultaneously from multiple perspectives, their bodies flattened and rearranged to fill the available surface area according to a complex set of compositional rules, with particular attention to the joints and the eyes, which are conventionalized in a way that makes the style immediately recognizable, but whose underlying complexity reveals itself only on extended study. Northwest Coast art has been deeply influential on modern Western art. It was a significant influence on the Surrealists and on later 20th century artists who were drawn to its simultaneous presentation of multiple viewpoints and its treatment of the boundary between human and animal forms. But the aspect of Northwest Coast civilization that most confounded European observers and that remains most directly relevant to any discussion of pre-contact American civilization is the potlatch. The potlatch is a ceremonial feast at which the host family demonstrates its wealth and social status, not by accumulating and displaying riches, as European aristocracy did, but by giving them away. At a major potlatch, the hosting family would distribute gifts to all guests on a scale that might impoverish them for years afterward. The more lavish the gifts, the higher the status achieved. In some cases, objects of great value were deliberately destroyed to demonstrate wealth, a practice that drove early European observers to near apoplexy. This is not, as Europeans often characterized it, irrational or primitive behavior. It is a different and in many ways highly sophisticated approach to the organization of social wealth. In an environment where seasonal abundance alternates with scarcity, and where the goods of the sea and forest cannot be stored indefinitely, a system that converts perishable wealth into durable social capital through generosity makes excellent practical sense. The family that gives away the most at a potlatch is not impoverished by the experience. It is enriched in the currency that matters most, which is the obligations of reciprocity that its gifts create in the recipients. The potlatch is in effect a complex financial instrument for the management of risk and the distribution of resources across a community. European authorities found it so threatening to the values of accumulation that underpin capitalist economies that the Canadian government actually banned the potlatch in 1885 and did not lift that ban until 1951. They recognized correctly that a society organized around generosity and the dispersal of accumulated wealth rather than its concentration, was incompatible with the values they were trying to impose. The ban did not eliminate the potlatch. It drove it underground, where it continued through the decades of suppression, maintained in secret by communities that understood it as the foundation of their social and political order, until it could emerge again openly after the law was finally changed. That story of suppression and survival is a microcosm of the larger story we are telling here. The effort to erase pre-contact American civilization was not only archaeological, a matter of misinterpreting or ignoring the physical evidence. It was also actively political and cultural, a matter of laws and policies and violence directed at living people practicing living traditions. Let us move to the southeastern corner of the continent, where a civilization called the Mississippian tradition, of which Cahokia was the greatest expression but not the only one, persisted into the contact period with enough vitality and complexity that European explorers actually encountered it and wrote about it in their journals. The expedition of Hernando de Soto, which spent 4 years between 1539 and 1543 wandering through the southeast in search of gold, left behind a detailed record of the indigenous civilizations it encountered. Those civilizations included large fortified towns, sophisticated political confederacies, elaborate ceremonial systems, intensive agriculture, and social hierarchies governed by hereditary chiefs who commanded enormous respect and significant power. De Soto encountered the paramount chief of the Coosa Confederacy, a political entity that controlled a network of towns and subordinate communities stretching across what is now northern Georgia, Alabama, and Tennessee. The chief of Coosa was carried on a litter by attendants, was approached with elaborate ceremony, and commanded the obedience of subordinate chiefs who brought their towns into the Confederacy in relationships of tribute and alliance. This was not a loose collection of villages. This was a state, not a state organized on European principles certainly, but a state in the functional sense, a hierarchical political organization controlling a defined territory, extracting tribute, maintaining internal order, and projecting power over subordinate communities. De Soto's expedition also encountered the Natchez people on the lower Mississippi, and the Natchez maintained a social and political system that was in some ways even more elaborate than what De Soto had encountered further east. The Natchez were governed by a figure called the Great Sun, a hereditary paramount chief who was treated as a sacred being, a divine ruler whose physical person was identified with the sun, and who was served by elaborate protocols of deference, including the practice of his retainers offering their own lives when he died, so that he would not be alone in the afterlife. Sound familiar? The Natchez Great Sun and the sacrificial burials at Cahokia's Mound 72 are connected. The Natchez were almost certainly the direct descendants of the Cahokian tradition, maintaining in the early contact period a version of the sacred chiefdom that Cahokia's peak culture had developed. When French colonists arrived in the lower Mississippi Valley in the early 18th century and began to document the Natchez, they left behind detailed accounts of a civilization that was already clearly in decline from what it had been, partly as a result of the epidemic diseases that had preceded European settlement, partly as a result of the disruption of the trade networks and political systems that had sustained it. But even in that reduced state, it was sophisticated enough that the French recognized it, reluctantly and condescendingly, as a civilization of sorts. And then in 1731, the French destroyed it. The Natchez War ended with the destruction of the Natchez homeland, the killing or enslavement of most of the population, and the dispersal of the survivors into neighboring peoples. The last organized expression of the Cahokian civilization was eliminated not by climate change or internal political failure, but by European military force. That is an important distinction, because the narrative of pre-contact American civilizations tends to focus on their internal causes of decline, the droughts and the political failures, and the environmental degradations that contributed to the dispersal of places like Cahokia and Chaco. Those were real. But the final chapter for most of these civilizations was written by epidemic disease and military violence, not by internal collapse. The civilizations were already weakened, already dispersed, already reduced from their peaks when European contact came. But the contact itself, and what followed from it, ensured that what remained could not recover and rebuild. The diseases that swept ahead of the colonists killed the people who carried the knowledge. The military campaigns killed the leaders who might have organized resistance and renewal. The policies of cultural suppression killed the practices and traditions that connected living people to their history. And then someone wrote a history that said the land had been empty. We need to talk about the mound builder controversy because it reveals something important about the history of American archaeological understanding that is still relevant today. When European settlers began moving into the interior of the continent in the 18th and 19th centuries, they encountered the earthworks. They could not miss them. The mounds were everywhere in the Ohio Valley, in the Mississippi Valley, in the Southeast, in the Great Plains. Hundreds of thousands of individual mounds, thousands of major mound complexes, earthworks covering the landscape from the Appalachians to the Rockies. The question of who built them was unavoidable, and the answer that a significant portion of white American society settled on, and that circulated widely in popular culture for most of the 19th century, was deeply revealing. A lost race, a vanished civilization, people of European or Middle Eastern or Phoenician or even Atlantean origin, a superior people who had built these extraordinary structures and had then been destroyed by the ancestors of the contemporary Native Americans, leaving behind only the mounds as evidence of their passing. This theory was, to put it plainly, a racist fantasy. It served a clear ideological purpose. If the people who built the mounds were a different and superior race that had been destroyed before the ancestors of modern Native Americans arrived, then the continent was not the homeland of any currently living people. It was a land whose previous superior inhabitants had already been displaced. The current Native American populations were thus not the inheritors of a great civilization, but merely the latest wave of primitive peoples in a land that had never been truly claimed or civilized in any meaningful sense. The lost race theory justified dispossession. If no living people could claim descent from the mound builders, then no living people had a claim based on ancestral relationship to the land those mounds sat on. The theory was also completely wrong. Systematic archaeological investigation demonstrated clearly by the end of the 19th century. Cyrus Thomas, working for the Smithsonian Institution's Bureau of Ethnology, spent 12 years excavating mounds throughout the eastern United States and producing what is still a foundational work in American archaeology. His 1894 report demonstrating conclusively that the mounds were built by the ancestors of contemporary Native American peoples, and that there was no evidence whatsoever of a separate, prior non-native civilization. But the lost race theory was not entirely wrong in one sense, not in its facts, which were fantasy, but in its recognition that something extraordinary had existed here, that the mounds were the product of civilization sophisticated enough to deserve serious attention, that the scale and organization they represented implied a level of social complexity that demanded explanation. The tragedy is that when the explanation was found, when the archaeological work made it undeniable that the mounds were built by the ancestors of contemporary Native peoples, the response was not to dramatically revise the understanding of what those peoples had achieved. The response was too often simply to stop being impressed. If the mounds were built by people who could be categorized as primitive, then the achievement of building them did not need to raise the category. That double standard, that the same achievement is impressive when attributed to a mythological lost race, but unextraordinary when attributed to actual Native American peoples, is still with us in certain corners of popular culture. We need to talk about something that the textbooks almost never mention, and that represents one of the most significant recent shifts in our understanding of pre-contact America. The Amazon, not strictly speaking North America, but the Amazon basin is part of the Western Hemisphere story, and what has been discovered there in the last 20 years completely upends the understanding of how complex civilization can develop in tropical forest environments. For most of the 20th century, the standard anthropological position on the Amazon was that the tropical forest environment was fundamentally inhospitable to the development of complex societies. The soils were poor, leached by the heavy rainfall into a nutrient-depleted substrate that could not support the kind of intensive agriculture that had supported the development of complex civilizations elsewhere. The Amazon was understood as a natural environment that humans inhabited at low densities as hunter-gatherers and small-scale horticulturalists, but that had never been a site of significant civilization. That understanding has been comprehensively destroyed by a combination of satellite imaging, LiDAR surveys, and careful archaeological fieldwork. The Amazon basin, it is now clear, was home before contact to a very large population, probably tens of millions of people, organized into complex societies with significant political hierarchies, substantial agricultural systems, and a built environment that transformed the landscape on a massive scale. The most dramatic evidence is the terra preta, the dark earths. Scattered throughout the Amazon basin, covering millions of acres in some estimates, are areas of soil that are dramatically different from the surrounding red-yellow tropical soils. The terra preta soils are deep black, rich in carbon and nutrients, and extraordinarily fertile. They also contain charcoal, bone, ceramic fragments, and other archaeological materials in quantities that demonstrate they are not natural formations. They are the product of deliberate human activity, the result of centuries or millennia of careful soil management in which organic materials, including charcoal produced through low oxygen burning, were incorporated into the soil layer in a way that permanently improved its fertility. The terra preta is an engineered soil, a deliberate modification of the natural substrate that created a long-term agricultural resource in an environment that would not naturally have supported intensive cultivation. The distribution of terra preta across the Amazon basin implies a population and a land management system at a scale that is genuinely staggering. Some researchers have estimated that the pre-contact Amazon may have supported a population of between 8 and 50 million people, a range so wide it reflects the genuine uncertainty of current evidence, but whose lower end is still dramatically higher than the near-zero estimate that the standard model had proposed. And then came the LiDAR. LiDAR, which stands for Light Detection and Ranging, is a remote sensing technology that uses laser pulses from aircraft to produce detailed three-dimensional maps of surface topography that in heavily forested environments. It can be configured to penetrate the forest canopy and image the ground surface below, revealing features that are invisible to conventional aerial or satellite photography. When LiDAR surveys were applied to various parts of the Amazon basin beginning around 2010, the results were transformative. Beneath the forest canopy, researchers found geometric earthworks of extraordinary size and complexity, raised platforms, causeways, circular and square enclosures, interconnected systems of raised fields. In some areas, the remains of what appear to be urban or proto-urban settlement patterns with densely packed residential and ceremonial structures arranged around open plazas, connected by roads and canals. In the southwestern Amazon, in what is now the Brazilian state of Mato Grosso, researchers have identified a network of connected settlements covering approximately 20,000 square kilometers, including multiple large centers with populations in the thousands and dozens of smaller villages connected by roads up to 50 meters wide and dead straight, running for kilometers through the forest. The entire system, dating to roughly 1250 to 1650 CE, has been described as an urban network of a complexity that the researchers involved in the study called startling and unexpected. In Ecuador and neighboring parts of Colombia and Peru, LiDAR surveys are revealing even larger and more complex urban landscapes beneath the forest. Work published in recent years described the discovery of a system of connected Upano culture settlements in the Ecuadorian Amazon that dates back 2,500 years and that covers an area larger than some of the major ancient city-states of the Old World. The settlement includes a central area with mounded earthworks, terraces, and a grid of roads connecting it to outlying communities, suggesting a level of urban planning and political organization that completely revises what anyone thought was possible in this environment at this time period. This is not ancient history in the sense of being irrelevant to what came later. The people of these Amazon civilizations were the ancestors of the people European explorers encountered when they first penetrated the forest in the 16th century, and the descriptions those early explorers left behind, which were dismissed for centuries as exaggeration or fantasy, now read as reasonably accurate accounts of what was there. Francisco de Orellana's 1541 journey down the Amazon produced a narrative by his companion Gaspar de Carvajal that described large, densely populated towns along the river, sophisticated chiefdoms, elaborate material culture, and a continuous band of settlements stretching for hundreds of miles. Scholars dismissed this for centuries as impossible, as myth, as the product of a diseased or fevered imagination. It was not myth, it was reporting. By the time the next significant European penetration of the Amazon occurred, perhaps 100 years later, the population had already been devastated by the diseases that had moved ahead of European contact, spreading through indigenous trade networks into regions where no European had yet arrived. The great towns of the river were empty. The fields were abandoned. The forest was already reclaiming the engineered landscape. The Europeans who came after saw what they assumed was nature. It was the aftermath of apocalypse. Now let us return to North America proper, and let us talk about something that the textbooks typically present as a transition, a passage from prehistory to history, from the era before contact to the era after. The problem with that framing is that it implies a before and after that is clean and clear, a dividing line after which Native American history becomes readable, documented, legible. But the contact period was not a clean transition. It was a catastrophe, a slow-motion disaster whose full dimensions unfolded over decades and centuries, and whose relationship to the pre-contact world is not one of before and after, but of continuity through crisis. We need to understand what epidemic disease actually did, not in the abstract, but in the specific, because the specifics are both more devastating and more complicated than the simple narrative allows. When European diseases hit a previously unexposed population, the effects were catastrophic for reasons that go beyond simple immunological naivety. The problem was not only that people had no prior exposure to these pathogens, and therefore no immune memory. It was that the diseases arrived in waves before any stable recovery could occur. Smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, bubonic plague, malaria, and a dozen other introduced diseases did not arrive sequentially with recovery time between them. They arrived in overlapping, mutually reinforcing waves, each one hitting a population already weakened by the previous ones, and they traveled faster than any European did. This last point is crucial and almost never adequately emphasized. The diseases moved through indigenous trade networks, carried by people who had no idea they were carrying anything. By the time a European explorer penetrated a new region, the diseases had often already arrived. The explorer wrote down a description of a diminished, disrupted population and assumed he was describing the normal state of affairs. Assumed he was describing what this land always looked like. He was not. He was describing the aftermath. De Soto's expedition through the southeast in the early 1540s followed the trail of a disease outbreak that had preceded him by only a few years. The large, sophisticated towns he encountered were already shadows of what they had been before the epidemic. Many of the towns he visited were described as having significant populations and organized political structures, but also as having been recently devastated, with many of the inhabitants dead and the survivors traumatized and disorganized. When the next European penetration of the same region occurred a century later, those towns were gone. The political confederacies had collapsed. The population was a fraction of what De Soto had found, And what DeSoto had found was already a fraction of what existed before the disease arrived. The full population of the pre-contact Southeast will never be known with certainty. But the careful demographic work that has been done suggests that the Mississippian world that DeSoto glimpsed, already diminished, may have had a pre-epidemic population of several million people. By 1700, the population of the same region was perhaps in the hundreds of thousands. That is not a natural variation. That is not the normal demographic pattern of a society that had always been small. That is the consequence of an event so catastrophic that it is genuinely difficult to find comparable precedents in human history. The Black Death killed perhaps a third of Europe's population in the mid-14th century, and is remembered as one of the worst catastrophes in the history of Western civilization. The death toll in the Americas from introduced disease was proportionally far larger. In some regions, by some estimates, it approached 90%. 90%. 9 out of every 10 people dead. Not in a single dramatic event, but in a slow, relentless, generation-spanning catastrophe that wiped out the farmers before their crops could be harvested, the healers before they could identify what was killing their patients, the elders before they could pass on the knowledge they carried, the leaders before they could organize resistance, the parents before their children could grow up. The survivors were not simply fewer in number. They were traumatized, disorganized, bereaved, and deprived of the social and technical knowledge that had sustained the systems they had inherited. A community that loses 90% of its population does not simply continue at 10% of its former capacity. It loses the redundancy that made its knowledge systems resilient. The survivors do not know what was known collectively before. The teachers are dead. The books, which were not books in the European sense, but ceremonies, oral traditions, architectural knowledge, agricultural practices, all of it was embodied in human beings, and the human beings were dead. What survived was a shadow. And the European observers who saw that shadow, and then the historians who relied on those observers' accounts, treated the shadow as the whole. There is another dimension of the pre-contact world that is almost entirely absent from the standard American history narrative, and it involves a word that Europeans used in a very specific and very loaded way when they applied it to the peoples they encountered in the Americas. The word is civilization. The debate about whether various Native American cultures qualified as civilizations is a debate that has been conducted almost entirely on European terms, using European criteria, and has therefore been systematically rigged against finding the answer yes. This is not a conspiracy. It is the inevitable consequence of asking whether an unfamiliar thing fits a familiar category, and then defining the category in terms of the familiar exemplars. When European scholars talked about civilization in the 19th century, they typically had in mind a cluster of characteristics that reflected their own history and their own values. Writing systems, cities, monumental architecture, metallurgy, state political organization, long-distance trade, economic specialization, and often, though not always explicitly, a commitment to progress, to the accumulation of technology and the progressive mastery of nature. Some of the criteria were met by some North American cultures at various points. Monumental architecture, certainly. State political organization, arguably. Long-distance trade, absolutely. Economic specialization, yes. But writing, not in the Americas north of Mexico in the conventional sense, and metallurgy limited, copper working but not smelting. But here is the question that the civilization debate almost never asks. What if those criteria are not the right ones? What if the question of whether a society qualifies as civilized should not be answered by comparing it to Europe, but by asking what it achieved, how it worked, how sophisticated its understanding of the world was, how well it served the needs of the people who lived in it, and how sustainable it was over time? By those criteria, the picture looks very different. The indigenous peoples of North America developed ecological knowledge of their environments that has not been fully matched by modern Western science. They practiced forms of land management that maintained the productivity and biodiversity of their ecosystems over thousands of years. They developed mathematical and astronomical knowledge sophisticated enough to produce architectural alignments that still impress professional astronomers. They created art traditions that modern art historians recognize as among the great achievements of world art. They maintained social systems that provided for the needs of their members with a degree of equity and security that was in many cases substantially greater than what was available to the peasant masses of contemporary European societies. They managed vast landscapes through controlled burning, selective harvesting, and other techniques to maintain the productivity of ecosystems while preserving the diversity that made those systems resilient. None of this appears in the textbooks as civilization. It appears, if it appears at all, as interesting cultural facts about peoples who had not yet achieved civilization, whose history was waiting to begin with European contact. That framing is not neutral. It is not simply a difference of perspective or a matter of cultural relativism. It is factually wrong. The people who built Cahokia and Chaco and the Hopewell earthworks and the Pacific Northwest plank houses were not pre-civilizational in any meaningful sense. They were civilized in ways that were different from European civilization, that reflected different values and different solutions to the fundamental human problems of how to organize society and sustain life, and that were in some respects more sophisticated and more durable than what Europe had achieved. The most durable test of any civilization is whether it can be maintained over time without destroying the environment that sustains it. By that test, many of the civilizations of pre-contact America performed remarkably well. Many of the ecological systems they managed were maintained in stable, productive states for centuries or millennia. The contrast with what has happened to those same landscapes under the management of the civilization that replaced them is instructive. Let us step back even further in time now, because there is a layer to this story that almost never gets told. A layer that sits beneath even the mound builders and the great houses and the coastal civilizations. A layer that is in some ways the most important of all, because it tells us about the world the first Americans entered and what they did when they arrived. The continent that the earliest Americans encountered was not the continent we know. It was wilder, stranger, more spectacular in certain ways, a world populated by megafauna, enormous animals that had no modern equivalents, that shaped the landscapes and the ecosystems in ways we can only partially imagine now. The mammoths and the mastodons were the most famous of these, their bones found from Alaska to Florida, from California to the Atlantic coast. But they were not alone. There were ground sloths as large as elephants, lumbering through forests on massive rear legs. Giant beavers the size of black bears, building dams that transformed entire river systems. Short-faced bears larger than any grizzly, the dominant predators of the interior. American lions bigger than their African relatives, saber-toothed cats, American horses and camels, which had evolved in the Americas millions of years earlier. And then, in an irony of natural history, gone extinct here while their ancestors spread across the old world. Terror birds in the south, enormous flightless predators, a world of biological abundance and predatory danger that has no modern analog. This was the world the first Americans entered, and they were entering it as apex predators, as hunters with sophisticated tools and cooperative hunting strategies, moving into an ecosystem whose large animals had evolved over millions of years without any human presence and therefore without any instinctive fear of the bipedal newcomers. The timing of the megafauna extinctions in North and South America has been debated for decades. They occurred roughly at the end of the last ice age, between about 13,000 and 10,000 years ago, and they were dramatic. In a relatively short period, somewhere between 30 and 40 generations, the ground sloths, the American horses and camels and lions and short-faced bears, all gone. Two competing theories have dominated the debate. The climate hypothesis argues that the end of the ice age brought environmental disruptions that drove these animals to extinction. The overkill hypothesis, proposed by ecologist Paul Martin, argues that the first Americans hunted these animals to extinction, moving rapidly across the continent and killing megafauna that had no fear of humans, in a wave of predation that eliminated species faster than they could adapt. The current evidence suggests that both factors were involved, but that human hunting played a larger role than climate alone can explain. The timing of extinctions correlates more closely with the spread of human populations than with specific climate events. The pattern is also global. Large animal extinctions tend to follow the arrival of modern humans in previously uninhabited regions, from Australia to Madagascar to the islands of the Pacific. But here is what is rarely discussed in the context of this debate. The extinction of the megafauna was itself a civilizational event. Not civilization in the formal sense, but in the sense that it permanently altered the landscape that subsequent American civilizations would inhabit. The mammoths and mastodons were keystone species, ecosystem engineers whose feeding behavior and movement patterns shaped the vegetation and maintained the landscape types that supported enormous biodiversity. Their disappearance, along with the other megafauna, fundamentally changed the character of North American ecosystems. Forests expanded where grazing had previously maintained grasslands. River systems changed as the giant beaver dams fell out of maintenance. The composition of plant communities shifted as the selective grazing pressure of large herbivores was removed. Understanding this does not diminish the achievement of those later civilizations, but it adds a layer of context that the standard narrative entirely lacks. The peoples who built Cahokia and Chaco and the Hopewell earthworks were managing landscapes that were already the consequence of an earlier fundamental transformation, and their sophisticated ecological knowledge was partly knowledge about how to work with, and in some cases recreate, the productivity that had existed before that transformation. The burning practices that maintained the great prairies of the Midwest, for example, partly replicated the grazing pressure that the extinct megafauna had previously exerted. The managed forests of the Pacific Northwest maintained species compositions that the large animals of the Pleistocene had previously helped to create. Indigenous land management was not just working with the natural landscape. It was in some respects compensating for the loss of the ecological engineers whose disappearance had left those landscapes less productive than they once had been. This is a story of extraordinary complexity, a story in which human beings were not simply passive inhabitants of a stable natural world, but active agents whose decisions from the very beginning of their presence in the Americas shaped the environments they and their descendants would inhabit. The first Americans were not living in an untouched paradise. They were already changing the world around them in ways that would have lasting consequences and would require adaptive ingenuity from every subsequent generation. Let us talk now about connections. The question of whether pre-Columbian contact between the Americas and the Old World occurred beyond the known Norse settlement at L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland around 1000 CE is one that gets tangled up with fringe theories and genuine scientific discovery in ways that make it important to approach carefully. The evidence for Norse contact is solid. L'Anse aux Meadows is real, authenticated, excavated, and carbon dated to around 1000 CE. The Norse sagas describe subsequent contacts and attempted colonization that failed. This is not disputed by any credible archaeologist. The evidence for Polynesian contact with South America is more recent and by now quite compelling. Genetic analysis of indigenous people from coastal South America, particularly from communities in Colombia and Chile and the surrounding regions, shows clear evidence of Polynesian genetic ancestry, dating to well before any European contact. The sweet potato, which is native to the Americas, was present in Polynesia long before any European vessel reached the Pacific. Its Polynesian name, Camara, is strikingly similar to its Quechua name in the Andes. Chickens with DNA matching South American pre-Columbian samples were present in Polynesia before European contact. The evidence has now been examined by leading geneticists and published in the most prestigious peer-reviewed scientific journals. The conclusion is considered well supported. Polynesian voyagers reached South America, probably sometime between 1000 and 1400 CE, had contact with indigenous South American peoples, and exchanged both plants and people with those communities. This is genuine, confirmed pre-Columbian transoceanic contact between the Americas and the Old World. It is not fringe speculation. What it does not support is the much more elaborate claims that circulate in popular ancient mystery culture. It does not support Egyptian or Phoenician or Chinese colonization of the Americas. It does not support the idea that the mound builders were European. All of those claims remain without credible physical evidence, and most of them serve the same ideological function as the old lost race theory, attributing the achievements of indigenous peoples to outsiders, which is a form of denial dressed up in the language of mystery. What the Polynesian connection does support is a more interesting and more accurate picture, one in which the Americas were not hermetically sealed from the rest of the world during the pre-Columbian period, one in which the primary creative force behind the extraordinary civilizations of the Western Hemisphere was indigenous peoples themselves, who achieved what they achieved through their own ingenuity, their own labor, and their own cultural development over thousands of years in response to their own environments and their own histories. That is the real story, the story of human creativity and achievement under circumstances that were often enormously challenging, in environments that required sophisticated knowledge to inhabit successfully, producing results that deserve to be understood as among the greatest achievements of the human species anywhere on Earth. And now let us speak plainly about something that sits at the core of all of this. The reason why the true history matters, and the reason why there has been such determined resistance to telling it. The standard American history narrative has enormous institutional momentum. It is embedded in textbooks chosen by state education boards with strong political incentives to prefer the comfortable founding myth. It is embedded in museum displays designed in the 19th century by people who held the racial theories of that period, and that have been updated only partially and unevenly since. It is embedded in popular culture, in the mythology of the frontier, in the stories Americans tell themselves about who they are and where they came from. Challenging that narrative is not simply an academic exercise. It has real political and legal implications. If the pre-contact civilizations of North America are recognized as the complex, sophisticated achievements they were, then the land on which those civilizations stood is not in any morally meaningful sense empty land that was available for the taking. If the peoples who built those civilizations are recognized as the direct ancestors of contemporary Native American peoples, then those peoples have claims rooted in history that are more substantial and more morally compelling than the standard story acknowledges. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990 requires institutions that receive federal funding to return human remains and sacred objects to their culturally affiliated tribes. The law recognizes that the bones in the museum cases and the objects in the collection drawers are not merely scientific specimens. They are the ancestors and the sacred heritage of living peoples. The law was a significant advance, but its implementation has been slow, contested, and incomplete, partly because of resistance from institutions that regard repatriation as a loss of scientific data, and partly because recognizing the claims of descendant communities requires recognizing the historical continuity that the standard narrative has always denied. The resistance to that recognition is not only an academic matter. It shows up in everything from pipeline routes that cross sacred landscapes to school curriculum decisions that determine what children learn about whose history this land carries. It shows up in the legal frameworks that define tribal sovereignty and in the policy decisions that determine what resources tribes can access to maintain their communities and their cultural practices. The history is not abstract. It lives in the present in the lives of people who are the direct descendants of the civilizations this story has been describing. Let us talk now about the people who are still here. Because the most powerful and persistent lie in the standard American history narrative is not the lie about what existed before European contact. It is the lie that it is gone. The descendants of every civilization we have discussed tonight are alive. They are not museum pieces or historical footnotes. They are contemporary human beings living in the 21st century, maintaining living relationships with their own histories, their own lands, and their own cultural traditions. The descendants of the Cahokian civilization are among the Osage Nation of Oklahoma, the Quapaw Nation, the Chickasaw Nation, the Muskogee Nation, and others. Their oral traditions carry the memory of the great city, though not always by the name archaeologists use. Their ceremonial practices carry the cosmological frameworks that Cahokia's architecture expressed. The descendants of the Chacoan civilization are the Pueblo peoples who have lived continuously in the Rio Grande Valley and in their mesa-top villages in Arizona since long before European contact. The Hopi, the Zuni, the Acoma, the dozens of Tewa, Tiwa, and Carasan-speaking Pueblo communities of New Mexico. All of them maintain living traditions that are direct continuations of the ancestral Puebloan world. Their ceremonies encode the astronomical knowledge that Chaco's builders inscribed in stone. Their pottery maintains the artistic traditions that Chacoan ceramics expressed. The descendants of the Hopewell world are among the peoples of the Midwest and the Great Lakes, the Miami, the Potawatomi, the Ojibwe, the Menominee, and others. The mounds that their ancestors built are still there, some of them at least, and they are still meaningful, still connected to living people's sense of who they are and where they come from. These peoples were not static. They did not freeze in the past when European contact came. They have been adapting, changing, responding to the colonial encounter for 500 years, as peoples everywhere in the world respond to changing circumstances. Some traditional practices were lost, others were transformed, new ones were adopted. Living cultures do not hold still, but they continued. That is the point. They continued. And in recent decades, something significant has been happening. The knowledge that was suppressed, the practices that were driven underground, the languages that were nearly extinguished, the connections to place and to history that were deliberately severed by colonial policy. All of this has been undergoing a process of recovery, revival, and reassertion. That is one of the most important and least understood phenomena in contemporary American life. There is one more piece of this story that must be told because it connects the deep past to the lived present in a way that is impossible to separate from everything else we have discussed. The story of the languages. At the time of European contact, somewhere between 300 and 1,000 distinct languages were spoken in North America alone. Each was not simply a communication system. Each was an irreplaceable way of organizing and understanding and expressing the human experience, developed over thousands of years to be perfectly suited to the specific environment, history, and social organization of the people who spoke it. Of those 300 to 1,000 languages, about 170 are still spoken today. Many are now spoken only by elders with no children learning them as their first language. Some have only a handful of fluent speakers. Perhaps 10 are spoken by enough people in enough family contexts that their survival into the next generation seems reasonably secure. The rest are gone. Not only the words, but the ways of understanding the world that those words encoded. The ecological knowledge embedded in the names for plants and animals and weather patterns and landscape features. The historical memory embedded in the names of places and the stories attached to them. The cosmological frameworks embedded in ceremonial language and narrative tradition. The mathematical and astronomical knowledge encoded in ritual speech. All of that is gone when a language dies, and it cannot be reconstructed. You can document the words in a dictionary. You can record the grammar in a linguistic description. But a language that is no longer spoken by children, no longer dreamed in, no longer used to argue and laugh and love and grieve, is not a living thing. It is a fossil. The language death that has occurred in North America over the past 5 centuries is one of the greatest intellectual and cultural catastrophes in human history. And it was not an accident or a side effect. The boarding school systems of the United States and Canada, which removed Indigenous children from their families and forbade them from speaking their languages under threat of physical punishment, were understood by their architects as programs of cultural destruction. The goal was explicit: eliminate the cultural foundations of Indigenous identity, kill the language, kill the transmission, kill the connection. That policy killed languages. It killed the knowledge those languages carried. And it killed in many cases the people themselves through disease, abuse, and the psychological destruction that comes from being systematically denied your own identity. But the languages are not all gone. And the movement to revitalize those that remain is one of the most powerful and important cultural and intellectual movements of our time. In communities across North America, Indigenous language teachers are working with the last fluent elders to document and transmit knowledge that would otherwise die with them. Language nests, communities where children are raised from infancy in the Indigenous language, are functioning in growing numbers. The Hawaiian language, which had declined to the point where its survival was in serious doubt in the 1980s, now has tens of thousands of speakers, including a new generation of children for whom it is a fully functional first language. That is not a recovery of the past. It is something new, something that uses the past as a foundation for a living present and a continuing future. It is what civilizations do when they survive, which is to adapt, to transform, to continue in new forms while maintaining the connections to what came before. And here at last is where this long journey has been going, because every story has a reckoning, a moment where the threads that have been running separately through the narrative finally come together. And you see what all of it was pointing toward. The cities were here, not just camps, not just villages. Cities with all the complexity, all the social stratification, all the engineering ambition, all the astronomical knowledge, all the trade connections, all the spiritual sophistication that the word city implies when we use it anywhere else in the world. The populations were here, not a few 100,000 people scattered thinly across a vast wilderness. Tens of millions of people living in communities that were embedded in regional and continental networks of exchange and influence and shared cultural practice. The knowledge was here, not primitive ecological awareness, but sophisticated scientific understanding of environments, of astronomical cycles, of plant chemistry and soil management and sustainable resource extraction, accumulated over thousands of years and maintained through oral traditions and architectural encoding and agricultural practice with a rigor and a precision that modern science is only now beginning to fully appreciate. The art was here, not decoration, not craft in the dismissive sense. Art, work of genuine beauty and original vision, expressing cosmological understanding and social identity and spiritual aspiration in forms that rank among the great achievements of human creativity anywhere in the world. The civilization was here, not a rehearsal for civilization, not a proto-civilization, not a civilization in waiting that needed European contact to be activated. Civilization, full, complex, sophisticated, and in many ways remarkably well adapted to the long-term requirements of sustainable human life on this continent. And then the ships came, and the diseases moved inland, and the populations collapsed, and the knowledge systems that had been encoded in human beings were lost when the human beings died. And the mounds were explained away as the work of a lost race. And the cities were converted into suburbs and golf courses. And the languages were beaten out of children in boarding schools. And the history was written in a way that said there was nothing here before we arrived that was worth counting. That story was a lie, and the people who told it knew it was a lie. At least some of them did, at least some of the time, and it was told because it was useful, because it made the taking easier to justify. Because a land that had never been civilized was a land that could be claimed without the kind of moral accounting that would have been required if the truth had been acknowledged. The truth is that what happened here between 1492 and the effective completion of the conquest of the continent was one of the largest and most consequential acts of civilization ending in human history. Not simply the defeat of one group of people by another, the destruction of dozens of distinct civilizations, each with its own history, its own knowledge systems, its own artistic traditions, its own ways of organizing human life, and maintaining relationships with the natural world. That destruction was not complete. It never is. Destruction is never complete because the people who survive it carry something forward. And the things they carry forward are not nothing. They are the seeds of what comes after. And what has come after in the living communities of native peoples across North America today is not the ghost of a vanished past. It is a present, a living, complex, contested, resilient, continuing present, insisting on its own reality against everything that has been done to deny it. The mounds are still there, still rising from the river valleys of Ohio and Illinois and Louisiana, from the coastal plains of the southeast, from the high desert of the southwest, covered with grass, cut through by highways, converted into golf courses, but still there, still shaped by the hands of the people who built them. The great houses are still there, still standing in the canyon walls, still aligning their doorways to receive the light of the winter solstice, still holding in their carefully laid stones the record of a civilization that understood the sky in ways that we are only now recovering the ability to appreciate. The earthworks are still there, geometric marvels of a precision that impresses professional engineers and professional astronomers, pointing to the moon and the sun, recording in earth and stone a knowledge of the cosmos that was accumulated through generations of careful, systematic, passionate observation. The peoples are still there, carrying their histories in their bodies and their ceremonies and their languages and their relationships to land that their ancestors shaped and managed and understood in ways that are now increasingly being recognized as among the most sophisticated ecological knowledge systems that the human species has ever developed. The history is still there, waiting in the earth, rising when the LiDAR surveys the Amazon and finds cities beneath the canopy, waiting in the DNA, speaking when the genetic analysis reveals the population bottleneck that the epidemic diseases caused, waiting in the oral traditions, insisting on their own accuracy when the archaeology finally catches up and confirms what the story said all along. The history is there. It has always been there. It does not need to be discovered or invented or constructed. It only needs to be received. And now it is late. The hour has turned in the direction of sleep and silence. And the questions that this story raises are the kind that settle slowly, that take time to find their full weight in the mind. You have heard tonight about cities that were here before the nation that now covers their remains had any idea they had existed. You have heard about populations that were vast and complex and deeply interconnected across a continent that was, before the ships came, one of the most elaborately peopled and culturally rich places on the surface of the earth. You have heard about knowledge systems of extraordinary sophistication, and about art of genuine beauty, and about engineering achievements that still impress the people who study them. You have heard about a catastrophe of almost incomprehensible scale, and about a survival that is in its own way equally impressive. This is American history, not the history of the nation that calls itself America, but the history of the land and the people who have lived on it from the beginning, a history that is far longer and far stranger and far richer and far more painful than the version in the textbooks. That version, the textbook version, is not adequate to the complexity of what actually happened. It is not adequate to the people who lived here. It is not adequate to the people who are their descendants. And it is not adequate to anyone who wants to understand the place where they live and the obligations that understanding might create. The better version is harder. It involves sitting with facts that are uncomfortable, that complicate the founding story, that raise questions about legitimacy and obligation that do not have easy answers. It involves recognizing that the land beneath every city and suburb and highway and golf course in this country has a history that goes back 10,000 years and more. And that history does not simply vanish because the current owners prefer not to think about it. But the better version is also more interesting and more honest and more respectful of the actual human beings who built this civilization, and the actual human beings who are their descendants, and the actual human beings who live today in a country whose foundations run deeper, and whose story extends further than the version in the textbooks has ever been willing to acknowledge. The mounds. Remember the canyon walls. Remember the surviving languages. Remember the ceremonies that have been maintained through everything that has been done to stop them. Remember, now perhaps we can begin to remember too. If tonight's journey through the true history of what was here before America helped you feel the weight and the richness of a past that most of us were never taught, then maybe tap like and subscribe so more people can find their way to these long, slow dives into the history the textbooks left out. I would love to know where in the world you are listening from and what time it is where you are. Drop a comment. Whether you are in a city built on land that has a name and a language that most of its current residents have never heard, or in a quiet place where the old history feels close, or somewhere in between, which is to say anywhere on this continent. For those who want to support this channel in a deeper way, the membership option is always there, though watching and listening is always more than enough. For now, there is nothing you need to do. The questions this story raises can wait until morning. The mounds will still be there then, still rising from the river valleys, still shaped by the hands of people who wanted to build something the earth would remember. The earth has remembered for 10,000 years and more. It has remembered. And through the night as you drift towards sleep, perhaps you can feel that remembering, the weight of it, the extraordinary age of it, the fact that the ground beneath your feet has been shaped by human hands for longer than most people ever imagined. By people who understood it and loved it and transformed it and built cities on it and told stories about it and buried their dead in it and watched the stars from it and kept fires burning on it through ice ages and droughts and epidemics and everything else that the long history of this place has thrown at the people who have lived here. That history is yours now in the sense that anyone who lives on this land inherits the obligation of knowing it. Not just the comfortable parts, all of it. The ships on the horizon in 1492 did not find a new world. They found an old one, older than anyone on those ships could have imagined, older than the civilization those sailors came from, older and in many ways wiser and more resilient and more deeply embedded in its landscape than anything that has replaced it. That old world is still here under the highways and the suburbs and the golf courses, in the living communities of the peoples who built it and maintained it and carried it forward through everything that has been done to end it. It is here. It has always been here. And now at last you know it too. Rest well. The history will be here when you wake. Good night. There is a conversation that archaeologists have been having among themselves for the last 40 years that has not yet made its way into popular understanding. And it concerns something that sounds almost impossibly mundane when you first hear it. Soil. Not soil as a metaphor. Not soil in the poetic sense of the land from which a civilization springs. Actual soil. The chemical composition of the earth in certain parts of North America. What is in it and what is not in it, and what the presence and absence of specific compounds tells us about what human beings were doing in those places for thousands of years before any written record was kept. The discipline that studies this is called geoarchaeology, and in the last few decades, it has become one of the most powerful tools available for reconstructing the pre-contact world, precisely because it bypasses the biases that have distorted so much of the conventional historical record. The earth does not lie in the way that historians can lie. The soil chemistry of a place is a record of what actually happened there, not of what anyone wanted to believe happened there or needed to believe happened there for political or ideological reasons. And what the soil chemistry of large parts of eastern North America tells us is that those landscapes were managed intensively and deliberately by human beings for far longer and over far larger areas than the standard story of pre-contact American life has ever acknowledged. The signatures are specific. Elevated phosphorus levels in soils indicate long-term human habitation, because human activity concentrates phosphorus from food, waste, and animal products in ways that natural processes do not replicate. Charcoal in specific distributions and concentrations indicates deliberate burning. Fire applied to the landscape not by lightning, but by hands. Patterns of seed distribution in ancient soil layers indicate the management of specific plant communities, the selective encouragement of useful species, and the discouragement of others. The presence of domesticated crop pollens at particular depths tells you when agriculture of various kinds began in a given location. And what these signatures collectively reveal, across site after site and region after region, is a pre-contact landscape that was not wilderness in the sense Europeans understood and recorded it. It was a cultural landscape, an anthropogenic landscape, a landscape that had been shaped, managed, modified, and maintained by human beings for thousands of years to a degree and at a scale that has only slowly become comprehensible to modern researchers. The great prairies of the interior, for example, those vast grasslands that stretched from Texas to Manitoba, that supported the enormous bison herds that became the most visible feature of Plains Indian life in the post-contact period. Those prairies were not simply natural formations. The charcoal record in the soils beneath them is clear. They were maintained by deliberate burning, by fire systematically applied to the landscape, by human beings who understood that burning promoted the growth of the grasses and forbs that bison needed, that concentrated bison herds in ways that made hunting more efficient, and that drove the ecotonal boundary between prairie and forest in ways that benefited specific communities. Without the burning, the forest would have advanced. The historical record of the contact period contains multiple accounts of European settlers watching prairies that had been maintained by indigenous burning for centuries slowly convert to woodland after the people who burned them were killed or removed. The grass gives way to shrubs. The shrubs give way to trees. The prairie becomes forest. The bison that depended on the grass move elsewhere or die. The ecological system that the burning had maintained collapses. And in the place of a carefully maintained cultural landscape, there is to European eyes just nature. Just what happens when you remove the human management. Just what the land would have looked like before people arrived. Except it would not have looked like that before people arrived. The landscape that existed before the first Americans came was the megafauna landscape. The Pleistocene world of mammoths and mastodons that grazed the grasslands and maintained them through their feeding. When those animals went extinct, the grasslands needed a new maintenance system. And the one that developed over thousands of years was fire. Human fire, deliberate, managed, systematic burning applied to the landscape by peoples who understood what they were doing and why they were doing it with a sophistication that Western ecologists have only recently begun to appreciate. This is not a small thing. This is the realization that the most characteristic landscape feature of the central North American continent, the great grassland ecosystem that shaped the entire ecology of the region and supported the distinctive Plains Indian cultures that became the most iconic images of Native American life, was not a natural formation. It was a human achievement, the result of thousands of years of deliberate landscape management by peoples who understood their environment deeply enough to maintain its productivity across generations and centuries. The same story plays out in different specific forms across every major ecosystem of the continent. The open forests of the East were maintained by burning. The oak savannas that once covered much of the Midwest were maintained by burning. The berry patches and root gardens of the Pacific Northwest were maintained by selective harvest and controlled burning. The salmon runs of the Northwest rivers were maintained by careful management of the fishing catch, by leaving enough fish to complete their spawning run and maintain the next year's population. The shellfish beds of the Atlantic and Pacific coasts were managed, their productivity maintained through practices of selective harvest that prevented the kind of depletion that modern fishing methods have produced. What Europeans encountered when they arrived in North America was not a wilderness. It was a garden, not a garden in the formal European sense with walls and beds and orderly rows of cultivated plants, but a garden in the sense of a landscape that had been deliberately shaped to maximize its productivity and sustainability through the application of human knowledge and human labor over thousands of years. The distinction matters enormously. A wilderness is an untouched natural space available for use, waiting for the application of civilization to realize its potential. A garden is someone else's achievement, someone else's labor, someone else's creation in which you are a guest or an interloper depending on the circumstances. North America was a garden. The people who made it were its owners in the deepest and most practical sense of that word, which is the sense of the people who made it what it was through their labor and their knowledge. That is the truth the soil has been trying to tell us, and it matters. Let us travel to the Great Plains and spend some time with a culture that is at once among the most visible in American popular consciousness and among the most thoroughly misunderstood. The Plains Indians. The image is so iconic that it has become almost impossible to see clearly. The feathered headdresses, the buffalo hunts, the horse warriors. These images have been reproduced so many times in so many contexts that they function almost as archetypes, as if they represent something ancient and primordial and essentially unchanged from time immemorial. They do not, or rather they represent something that was, by the standards of human history, extremely recent. The culture that produced the mounted buffalo hunter of the Great Plains was not 10,000 years old. It was at most 200 or 300 years old. The horse did not return to North America until the Spanish brought it in the 16th century. The horse culture of the Plains Indians was a rapid, brilliant, adaptive response to the presence of an entirely new resource, a response that transformed the economic and military capabilities of the peoples who adopted it in ways that produced one of the most rapid and complete cultural transformations in recorded human history. But this means that the culture Europeans encountered when they finally penetrated the Great Plains was not the original Plains culture. It was a modified version of it, shaped by the same colonial encounter that had transformed every other indigenous culture on the continent. The peoples of the Plains had adapted brilliantly and successfully to the changed circumstances that the colonial encounter had created, including the availability of horses and later firearms, and including the massive ecological disruption caused by the removal of indigenous peoples from their eastern homelands, who then moved west and competed with established Plains communities for access to the buffalo resource. What existed on the Great Plains before the horse, before the colonial disruption, before the transformation of the 1600s and 1700s, was something different. More settled in some places, more dependent on agriculture in the river valleys, more connected to the broader networks of trade and ceremony that link the plains to the Mississippi Valley and the Southwest. More complex in many ways than the simplified hunter-warrior image of Plains life that popular culture has preserved. The archaeology of the Plains, particularly of the river valley communities that farmed the Missouri and its tributaries, reveals towns of considerable size and sophistication, with permanent houses, elaborate storage systems, and deep participation in the continental trade networks. The Mandan and Hidatsa people of what is now North Dakota maintained earth lodge villages on the Missouri bluffs for centuries before European contact, farming corn and squash and sunflowers in the rich river-bottom soils, and trading the agricultural surplus for buffalo robes and dried meat from the nomadic hunters of the higher plains. Their villages were major nodes in the continental trade network, places where goods from the Pacific Coast and the Great Lakes and the Gulf Coast came together and were redistributed. When Lewis and Clark wintered near a Mandan village in 1804 and 1805, they were guests of a community that was already deeply diminished from what it had been before. The epidemics of the 1780s and 1790s had devastated its population. What they described as a collection of Indian villages was the remnant of a civilization that had in its prime been a major economic and political force in the northern plains. They did not know this because the history of that civilization had been destroyed along with most of the people who carried it. That is the pattern repeated everywhere in the contact era record. The explorers and the settlers arrived to find a diminished, disrupted, often desperate people and assume they are seeing the natural state of things. They are seeing always the aftermath of catastrophe. We should talk about the Mississippi River, because the Mississippi is not simply a geographic feature of the American landscape. It is in the context of North American prehistory something closer to what the Nile was to ancient Egypt, a highway, an organizing principle, a line of connection along which ideas and goods and peoples moved for thousands of years, and along which the greatest civilizations of the interior organized themselves. The Mississippian tradition, named for the river along which its most characteristic sites cluster, was not a single culture or a single political entity. It was a shared cultural complex, a set of overlapping practices and beliefs and material traditions that spread along the river valley and its tributaries from roughly 800 CE to the contact period, binding together communities that spoke different languages and maintained distinct local identities, but that shared a ceremonial system, an artistic vocabulary, an architectural tradition, and a set of prestige goods that were traded across the entire network. The centerpiece of the Mississippian ceremonial complex was the platform mound, the flat-topped earthen structure that supported temples and chiefly residences. These mounds were built at sites large and small throughout the Mississippian world, from the great complexes of the central Mississippi Valley to smaller regional centers scattered across the southeast. They were the architectural expression of a shared cosmological vision, the world above accessible from the world below through the physical elevation of the sacred center. And the goods traded across the Mississippian world carried the symbols of that vision, the cosmological imagery that archaeologists call the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex, or sometimes the Southern Cult. Engraved shell cups and gorgets depicting the cosmic axis and the powers of the upper and lower worlds. Copper plates showing warrior figures in elaborate ceremonial regalia. Ceramic vessels in the forms of humans and animals and hybrid beings. Stone pallets and pipes decorated with the same recurring symbols. The weeping eye, the hand and eye motif, the cross and circle that may represent the four directions and their center. These objects moved across thousands of miles. A copper plate found in Oklahoma carries the same symbolic vocabulary as one found in Tennessee or Georgia or Florida. The same motifs appear on ceramics from Illinois and Alabama. This was not coincidence or independent invention. This was a shared system of meaning maintained across an enormous territory by networks of trade and ceremony and political alliance. And the Mississippian world was politically sophisticated. The paramount chiefs who commanded the great centers like Cahokia and Moundville and Etowah exercised authority over networks of subordinate communities that paid tribute, provided labor, and deferred to the paramount's ritual and political power. These were not simple tribal confederacies. They were proto-states, hierarchical political entities with the capacity to mobilize large amounts of labor and resources for construction projects, military campaigns, and ceremonial purposes. The question of whether these polities reached the level of organization that political scientists typically classify as chiefdoms or states is partly a definitional one and partly a matter of the evidence available. What is clear is that they were far more politically complex than the popular image of Native American political organization typically acknowledges, and that this complexity was not a recent development, but the product of centuries of political evolution, building on the Hopewell tradition and the even earlier mound-building cultures that preceded it. When De Soto moved through the Southeast in the 1540s, he was moving through a landscape organized by this political system. He was demanding cooperation from paramount chiefs who had the authority to compel that cooperation from their subordinate communities. He was fighting wars against political entities that could field armies of thousands. He was being received in towns that were by any reasonable measure cities, with populations in the thousands organized around central plazas and platform mounds, surrounded by agricultural fields that fed populations of a scale that simple hunter-gatherers could not have supported. And in the century after de Soto's expedition, disease removed most of this from the landscape. Not all of it, not immediately, but relentlessly and cumulatively. The political confederacies collapsed because the leaders died, and there was no one of equivalent authority and legitimacy to replace them. The agricultural systems were disrupted because the farmers died before the harvest. The trade networks contracted because the communities that had been nodes in the network were devastated and could no longer maintain the exchange relationships that had been their foundation. By 1650, the Mississippian world was a shadow of what it had been a century before. By 1700, many of the great centers were entirely abandoned. By 1750, many of the peoples who had inhabited those centers had merged with neighboring groups, had moved to new locations, or had been destroyed entirely. And the Europeans who arrived to take possession of this landscape described it as wilderness, as empty land, as territory that had never known civilization and was now for the first time being brought under productive human management. The lie was not always conscious. In many cases, the people telling it genuinely believed it, because what they could see was a diminished landscape from which most of the population had been removed, and they had no way of knowing what had been there before. The history of what had been removed was not available to them, or they had no interest in learning it, which in practical terms amounts to the same thing. But the lie was also convenient, and convenient lies tend to be told repeatedly, and then written down, and then taught in schools until they become the ground on which other lies are built. And the entire edifice of false history rises until it is so tall and so familiar that it feels like solid ground. The mounds are still there, rising from the fields of Illinois and Mississippi and Alabama and Oklahoma and Ohio, rising in the yards of suburban houses, in the centers of golf courses, in state parks that preserve a small fraction of what once was an almost universal feature of the Eastern American landscape. They are still there, waiting for the history that surrounds them to be told honestly. Let us return to the question of scale, because scale is the thing that is most difficult to convey and most important to understand. When we talk about the pre-contact civilizations of North America, we are not talking about a few scattered examples of sophistication in an otherwise undeveloped landscape. We are talking about a pattern that covered the entire continent, a density of human achievement, of cultural complexity, of social organization, and engineering ambition that was distributed across the land from coast to coast and from Arctic to subtropical. In the Arctic, the peoples of the far north had developed the most sophisticated cold weather survival technologies in human history. The igloo, the kayak, the umiak, the harpoon with its detachable head, the clothing systems that allowed human beings to survive and work in temperatures that would kill an unprotected person in minutes. This was not primitive adaptation. This was engineering of the highest order, solutions to problems that push the limits of what human technology could achieve, developed through centuries of innovation and refinement in one of the most demanding environments on Earth. In the Great Basin, the peoples of the desert interior had developed knowledge of their sparse and unpredictable environment that allowed them to extract a living from landscapes that seemed to outsiders barely capable of supporting life. Their knowledge of plant resources was encyclopedic, encompassing hundreds of species with detailed understanding of their seasonal availability, their preparation requirements, their nutritional value, and their medicinal properties. Their water management knowledge allowed them to locate and exploit sources that were invisible to people without their accumulated knowledge. Their basket-making traditions produced containers of such technical perfection that modern weavers have been unable to reproduce some of the finest examples. In California, before European contact, The region supported one of the highest population densities of any hunter-gatherer society in the world, estimated at between 300,000 and 700,000 people in the area of what is now California alone. This population was sustained by sophisticated management of the oak woodland environment, the burning and selective harvest of the acorn crop, and the elaborate acorn processing technology that transformed a food that is inedible raw into a staple that could sustain large settled populations. California's indigenous people spoke more than 70 distinct languages, representing a linguistic and cultural diversity that was by some measures greater than that of the entire European continent. In the southeast, the Calusa of South Florida had built a chiefdom based not on agriculture, but on the extraordinary abundance of the coastal waters, maintaining a hierarchical political organization and a material culture of considerable sophistication without ever developing agriculture in the conventional sense, simply because the estuaries and the coral reefs and the coastal fisheries were so productive that they did not need to. In the northeast, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the League of the Iroquois Nations, had developed by the contact period one of the most sophisticated political systems in the Americas. A constitutional framework that brought together 5, and later 6, previously warring nations under a common structure that preserved the sovereignty of each member, while creating mechanisms for collective decision-making, conflict resolution, and mutual defense. The great law of peace that governed the Confederacy was an oral constitution of considerable complexity, maintained through a mnemonic system of wampum belts whose patterns encoded the specific provisions of the agreement. The political sophistication of the Haudenosaunee was recognized by European observers who engaged with Confederacy diplomats on something approaching equal terms for much of the colonial period. The Confederacy's ability to play European powers against each other and to maintain its own political position through most of the 17th and 18th centuries is a testament to the sophistication of its political organization and the diplomatic skills of its leadership. And the influence of the Haudenosaunee model on American political thinking has been documented, though it remains contested in its specifics. Benjamin Franklin's Albany Plan of Union of 1754, which proposed a federal structure for the colonial governments, drew explicitly on the Confederacy as a model. The influence on the later constitutional thinking of the founders is harder to trace but plausible, given the extensive contact between colonial leaders and Haudenosaunee diplomats in the decades before the Revolution. If there is any single idea that the pre-contact civilizations of North America contributed most directly to the world that came after them, it may be this one. The idea that sovereign peoples can organize themselves into federal structures without surrendering their individual sovereignty. The idea that political union need not mean political subordination. The idea that large-scale political organization can be achieved through consent rather than conquest. That is not a small contribution. That is one of the foundational ideas of modern democratic theory. And it was being practiced in sophisticated form in North America before any European political theorist had articulated it in writing. There is something else that deserves to be said directly, because it is easy to lose sight of in the complexity of the historical and archaeological detail. The people we have been talking about tonight were not abstractions. They were not symbols or lessons or evidence for political arguments. They were people, human beings with the full range of human experience, who loved and grieved and hoped and feared and made things and told stories and watched the stars and raised children and argued with their neighbors and faced mortality with whatever frameworks of meaning they had constructed to help them do so. They built the mounds because building mattered to them. Because the act of moving Earth and shaping it into something geometrically precise and cosmologically meaningful was an expression of something they cared about deeply. They made the copper headdresses and the shell gorgets and the mica cutouts because beauty mattered to them. Because the world contained things that were worth making beautiful representations of. They aligned their buildings to the solstices because the rhythms of the sun and moon mattered to them. Because living in conscious relationship with the cosmic cycles felt important and right and necessary. They were human, not proto-humans, not pre-civilizational humans, not humans waiting to become civilized in someone else's sense of the word. Humans fully, completely, in every sense of the word human. The civilization they built was not a rehearsal for the civilization that replaced it. It was the real thing. It was civilization in the fullest sense, expressing the values and the knowledge and the aspirations and the social creativity of the people who made it. And what was done to it was not progress. What happened to North American civilization between 1492 and the end of the 19th century was not the replacement of something lesser with something better. It was the destruction of something extraordinary by something that was in many respects less sustainable, less equitable, less knowledgeable about the landscape it was occupying, and less successful by any long-term measure of civilizational health. That is a hard thing to say. It is harder still to mean it, but the evidence supports it. The soil chemistry, the ecological record, the demographic history, the archaeological data, all of it supports the conclusion that what existed here before 1492 was in many of the ways that matter most for the long-term survival of human civilization more successful than what replaced it. Not in the ways that made European expansion possible. Not in terms of military technology or epidemic disease resistance or the organizational capacity to mobilize resources at continental scale for purposes of conquest. But in terms of living in sustainable relationship with the land, of maintaining the productivity of ecosystems over centuries, of organizing social life in ways that provided for the needs of community members without the extreme inequality that marks most of the history of Western civilization. That is not nostalgia. That is not romanticism about the past or the noble savage fantasy that European literature created. It is a straightforward assessment of the evidence. And it matters not because the past can be changed, but because the future can be. The knowledge that sustained indigenous North American civilizations for thousands of years is not simply a historical curiosity. It is a practical resource. The ecological knowledge that maintained the prairies and the forests and the river systems. The social knowledge that organized communities around principles of reciprocity and collective well-being. The astronomical knowledge that kept communities in conscious relationship with the temporal cycles that govern agricultural productivity. All of this is knowledge that remains relevant. The people who carry that knowledge are still here. Their communities are maintaining it, recovering it where it was suppressed, teaching it to new generations, and offering it in various contexts and with various conditions to a wider world that needs it. That is the final piece of the story, not the tragedy of what was lost, though that tragedy is real and enormous. Not the injustice of what was done, though that injustice is also real and enormous and ongoing. But the persistence of what survived, the extraordinary tenacity of civilizations that refused to be fully destroyed, the knowledge and the art and the ceremony and the relationship to place that persisted through everything that was done to end it. And the people who carried it forward, who maintained it in secret when it was illegal, who taught it to their children when teaching it was dangerous, who refused generation after generation to accept the story that said their history was over and their civilization was gone and their land was empty and their knowledge was irrelevant. They were right to refuse. The history was not over. The civilization was not gone. The land was not empty. The knowledge was not irrelevant. It was all still there, as it is still there now, as it will be there tomorrow. That is the version the textbooks left out. And now at the end of this long night, you have it. Let us go back to something specific that tends to get lost in the big picture. Because the big picture, as necessary as it is, can inadvertently replicate one of the very distortions it is trying to correct, the distortion of treating indigenous North American peoples as a single undifferentiated mass. As if the Ojibwe and the Navajo and the Comanche and the Chinook were all expressions of the same thing, all chapters in the same story, all relevant to each other in the way that France and Germany are relevant to each other as expressions of European civilization. They are not. The cultural diversity of pre-contact America was staggering in its complexity. The diversity of languages alone, 300 to 1,000 distinct languages depending on how you count and classify them, is a first indicator of how much diversity underlies the single category Indigenous North Americans that popular culture uses as if it referred to something coherent and unified. But the diversity goes far deeper than language. The architectural traditions of the continent range from the multi-story stone masonry of the Puebloans to the enormous cedar plank houses of the northwest coast to the earth lodges of the plains, river villages to the bark wigwams of the eastern woodlands to the pit houses of the plateau to the skin tents of the high plains to the chickees of the Florida Everglades. Each of these architectural forms represented a distinct technological tradition, adapted to specific environmental conditions and reflecting specific cultural values about the organization of space and the relationship between dwelling and landscape. The cosmological systems of different cultures were equally distinct. The Lakota cosmos organized itself around the great sacred hoop, the circle of connection between all living things, the interrelationship of all beings in a web of obligation and reciprocity. The Puebloan cosmos organized itself around the vertical axis connecting the underworld of origin to the surface world of human habitation to the upper world of sky powers. The axis physically represented by the Sipapu and the floor of the Kiva, the hole through which the ancestors had emerged from the earth at the beginning of the current world. The Haudenosaunee cosmos organized itself around the turtle's back, the island that the Earth Woman had fallen onto when she descended from the sky, the original mother from whom all North American life had grown. These are not the same vision in different cultural clothing. These are genuinely distinct philosophical and spiritual systems, reflecting genuinely different understandings of how the world is organized and what human beings owe to the cosmos in which they find themselves. The social systems were equally diverse. Some cultures organized themselves around matrilineal clans, with identity, inheritance, and social obligation flowing through the female line. Others organized around patrilineal systems. Some maintained relatively egalitarian social structures with fluid, situational leadership. Others maintained steep hereditary hierarchies with defined ranks and elaborate protocols governing the relationships between ranks. Some practiced polygyny. Others were strictly monogamous. Some had elaborate systems of formal adoption that could incorporate outsiders into the social fabric with full rights and obligations. Others maintained sharp distinctions between members and outsiders. The point is not to catalog these differences for their own sake. The point is that the category we so casually invoke when we say Native Americans or Indigenous peoples of North America contains within it a degree of cultural diversity that is genuinely comparable to the diversity of the entire Eurasian continent. Lumping all of it together under a single label, as American popular culture routinely does, is roughly equivalent to talking about the civilization of Eurasia as if ancient Rome, Tang Dynasty China, and the Mughal Empire were all expressions of the same cultural tradition. They are not, and the differences matter. They matter because each of these distinct traditions represents a distinct intellectual achievement, a distinct solution to the fundamental human problems of how to organize society, how to understand the cosmos, how to maintain the productivity of the land, how to transmit knowledge across generations, how to manage conflict and maintain social cohesion, how to face mortality with dignity and meaning. Each of these traditions is an irreplaceable part of the human heritage. And each of the hundreds that were destroyed or seriously damaged in the colonial encounter represents an irreplaceable loss, a body of knowledge, and a way of being human that cannot be reconstructed or replaced. There is a place in the American Southwest that almost nobody who is not a Pueblo person or a devoted student of American archaeology knows about, and that deserves far more attention than it receives. It is called Pacuim, and the Spanish name reflects the fact that it was the Spanish colonizers who encountered its ruins in the 17th century and gave it the name by which it is known to most outsiders. The Pueblo people who built it, and who are its descendants know it by its native name, Casas Grandes. And it was one of the most extraordinary urban centers in pre-contact America north of the Valley of Mexico. Pacoima sits in the valley of the Casas Grandes River in what is now the state of Chihuahua, Mexico, just south of the current border with New Mexico. At its peak, roughly between 1200 and 1450 CE, it was home to between 2,000 and 5,000 people living in a multi-story adobe complex of extraordinary size and sophistication. The main residential compound rose 3, and in places 4 stories, contained hundreds of rooms arranged around plazas and interior courts, and was supplied with running water through a system of canals that brought water from a spring nearly a kilometer distant and distributed it through ceramic pipes to individual rooms and plazas. Running water in a room in a multi-story apartment building in northern Mexico in the 13th century. Pacoima was also the center of a remarkably sophisticated craft production and long-distance trade system. Its most distinctive contribution to the continental trade network was the macaw, the large, brilliantly colored tropical parrot, whose feathers were essential in ceremonial practice across the entire ancestral Puebloan world and beyond. Archaeologists have found at Pacoima the remains of over 300 macaws, along with the pens and aviaries in which they were raised, the evidence of a large-scale captive breeding operation producing birds specifically for the feather trade. Think about what this means. Someone 1,500 years ago understood the demand for macaw feathers across the northern desert world well enough to establish a commercial breeding operation, build the infrastructure to house and feed hundreds of large tropical birds far from their natural habitat, and develop the trade networks to distribute the product to communities hundreds of miles to the north. This is commercial thinking. This is long-range economic planning. This is the kind of market awareness and organizational capacity that we associate with sophisticated commercial societies. And the turquoise trade that ran through Pacoima was equally sophisticated. Turquoise from the mines of what are now New Mexico and Nevada moved south through Pacoima on its way to the major Mesoamerican centers, where it was valued as a sacred material. Copper from Mexican workshops moved north through the same system. The people of Pacoima were intermediaries in a continental trade network that connected the cultures of the American Southwest with the great civilizations of central Mexico. And they managed that intermediary role with a commercial sophistication that left them wealthy, powerful, and architecturally ambitious. Pacoima was abandoned around 1450 CE, burned, and apparently never reoccupied. The reasons are unclear. There are signs of violence. There are signs of environmental stress. There are signs of social disruption. Whatever happened, it was sudden enough that the burning left objects in place, giving archaeologists an unusually complete picture of the community's material culture at the moment of its end. The descendants of Pacoima's builders are among the Pueblo peoples of New Mexico, who carry in their oral traditions the memory of a great southern city and the migrations that brought their ancestors north after that city's end. The Hopi and Zuni traditions in particular contain references to communities of the South, to turquoise and macaws, to a time of gathering and dispersal that archaeologists now recognize as corresponding to the period of Pacoima's fluorescence and decline. Now let us talk about something that most accounts of pre-contact American civilization never adequately address, which is the question of what these civilizations were for. What were the people who built them trying to achieve? What values animated the extraordinary investments of labor and ingenuity and organization that produced the mounds and the great houses and the earthworks and the trade networks and the ceremonial systems? This is a question that archaeology can answer only partially, because the archaeological record preserves material objects better than it preserves the ideas and the feelings and the aspirations that those objects expressed. But it is not entirely beyond recovery, particularly when the material record is combined with the oral traditions and the living practices of descendant peoples, who carry in modified but continuous form the values that animated their ancestors' achievements. And what those combined sources suggest is a set of values that is in some ways strikingly different from the values that animated European civilization at the same period. The first and perhaps most fundamental difference concerns the relationship between humans and the natural world. The dominant European tradition, rooted in the Genesis account of creation, conceived of human beings as categorically distinct from and superior to the rest of nature, placed by God above the animals and given dominion over the earth. This concept of dominion authorized the exploitation and transformation of the natural world in ways that European civilization progressively pursued with increasing intensity. The dominant indigenous North American tradition conceived of the relationship between humans and the natural world very differently. Not as a hierarchy with humans at the top, but as a web of relationships in which humans were participants among many other participants, each with its own perspective and its own claims and its own requirements for respectful treatment. The animals were not simply resources to be exploited. They were beings with their own agency and their own power who permitted humans to use them if humans maintained the proper relationships of respect and reciprocity. This is not simply a different religious belief. It is a different framework for thinking about the relationship between a human community and the ecosystems it depends on. A framework that tends to produce different behaviors and different outcomes. A framework that says the salmon is a being with its own rights who permits you to catch it if you do so with respect will produce different fishing practices than a framework that says the salmon is a natural resource to be exploited to the maximum sustainable yield. Both frameworks may produce sustainable fishing in the long run, but they do so for different reasons and through different mechanisms. And the indigenous framework may be more robust in the face of the temptations that arise when short-term profit conflicts with long-term sustainability. The second major difference concerns the relationship between the individual and the community. The dominant European tradition, particularly as it developed through the early modern period and into the Enlightenment, conceived of the individual as the fundamental unit of social and moral significance, prior to and more fundamental than the community. Rights inhere in individuals. Property is held by individuals. Contracts are made between individuals. The community is a construction of individuals who come together for mutual benefit. The dominant indigenous North American tradition conceived of the relationship between individual and community very differently. The individual was understood to be constituted by relationships, embedded in kinship systems and clan obligations and ceremonial responsibilities that were prior to and more fundamental than individual preference or individual rights. The community was not a construction of individuals, but the context within which individuals became who they were. This difference in fundamental social philosophy produced different social structures, different economic systems, different approaches to the management of resources and the distribution of wealth. The sharing economies of many indigenous communities, in which surplus was distributed rather than accumulated, in which the obligation to give to those who needed was as fundamental as the right to receive, were expressions of this communal orientation. They were not simply nice cultural practices. They were systematic approaches to social organization that maintained social cohesion, prevented the extreme inequality that destabilizes societies, and provided resilience against the kinds of individual misfortune that afflict everyone at some point in life. The third major difference concerns the relationship to time. The dominant European tradition, shaped by linear conceptions of history and notions of progress, conceived of time as moving in one direction from past to future, with the future being better than the past because of the accumulation of knowledge, the improvement of technology, and the progressive realization of human potential. Many indigenous North American traditions conceived of time very differently, as cyclical rather than linear, organized around the recurring rhythms of the natural world, the seasons, the astronomical cycles, the life cycles of plants and animals. In this conception, the appropriate relationship to the past was not to leave it behind, but to maintain continuity with it, to renew the connections that sustain social and cosmic order, rather than to innovate and improve and replace. This cyclical conception of time was not anti-intellectual or opposed to change. It was a different way of relating to the accumulated knowledge of the past, one that emphasized the importance of maintaining and transmitting what had been learned over generations, rather than constantly replacing it with something new. In a context where the crucial knowledge was ecological, where understanding the long-term patterns of weather and wildlife and plant productivity was literally a matter of survival, the conservative maintenance of accumulated knowledge was not a limitation. It was a strength. These three differences, in the relationship to nature, in the relationship between individual and community, and in the relationship to time, are not the only differences between indigenous and European civilizational values, but they help explain some of the most dramatic differences in outcome. They help explain why indigenous civilizations were able to maintain the productivity of their landscapes over thousands of years in ways that European civilization has not. They help explain why indigenous communities tended toward greater social equality and greater provision for the vulnerable than comparable European communities. They help explain why indigenous oral traditions maintained accurate ecological and historical knowledge over hundreds of generations. These are not minor cultural differences. They are differences in the fundamental frameworks through which people understand and respond to the world. And they're differences that have enormous practical consequences. One of the most consequential and least understood aspects of pre-contact American civilization concerns something that is almost never discussed in popular accounts. It concerns the plants. The agricultural revolution in the Americas was one of the most significant events in human history. The development of agriculture in the Americas occurred independently of its development in the Old World, and it produced a set of domesticated plants that were in several cases more productive and more nutritionally complete than any of the plant species that Old World agriculture had developed. Maize, potatoes, sweet potatoes, tomatoes, peppers, squash, pumpkins, beans, sunflowers, peanuts, avocados, cacao, vanilla, tobacco, quinoa, cassava. These are not minor additions to the world food supply. They are foundational crops whose adoption by Old World agriculture transformed the food security and the population capacity of Europe, Asia, and Africa in ways that are still unfolding. Maize, developed over thousands of years from a barely edible wild grass called teosinte by farmers in what is now Mexico, is now one of the three most important food crops in the world. By caloric contribution to the human diet, it feeds billions of people. The transformation of teosinte into productive maize required generations of careful selection, generations of farmers who understood enough about plant genetics to identify and preserve the individual plants whose seeds had the characteristics that made them more productive. This was science, applied science of a sophistication that produced results that have changed the trajectory of human history. Potatoes, developed from wild species in the Andes by South American farmers who maintained hundreds of varieties adapted to specific altitude, soil, and climate conditions, provided the caloric foundation for the population explosion of 18th century Europe, particularly in Ireland and Germany. Without the potato, the populations that fueled the Industrial Revolution could not have been fed. Without indigenous Andean agricultural science, the potato would not have existed. The Irish famine of the 1840s, which killed over 1 million people and drove another million from the island, was a consequence of excessive dependence on a single potato variety, the monoculture vulnerability that modern agriculture still struggles with. The solution to that vulnerability, ironically, lies in the genetic diversity of the hundreds of wild and semi-domesticated potato varieties that Andean farmers maintained over thousands of years, varieties that plant breeders today are using to develop disease-resistant modern cultivars. The very diversity that indigenous farmers maintained as a matter of practical wisdom is now the genetic resource that modern agricultural science depends on for the future security of the world food supply. This is not ancient history. This is not a matter of paying historical debts to peoples whose contributions are now irrelevant. This is an ongoing, urgent practical reality. The genetic diversity maintained by indigenous agriculture over thousands of years is a resource that modern civilization needs. The ecological knowledge maintained by indigenous communities over thousands of years is a resource that modern environmental management needs. The social knowledge maintained by indigenous communities over thousands of years, the knowledge of how to organize communities around principles of reciprocity and collective well-being and sustainable relationship to the land, is a resource that modern societies need. The people who hold that knowledge are still here. Their communities are maintaining it and teaching it and offering it in various contexts to a world that needs it. The question is whether the world is finally ready to receive it. Let us talk in this late hour about the Serpent Mound, because the Serpent Mound is one of those places where the weight of the pre-contact world becomes suddenly tangibly real in a way that all the statistics and all the dates and all the archaeological analysis cannot quite achieve on their own. The Serpent Mound lies on a ridge above Brush Creek in Adams County, Ohio. It is an earthen effigy mound, which means it is a mound built in the shape of an animal rather than as a platform or a burial structure. And the animal it depicts is a serpent, approximately 1,300 feet long, its body undulating in 7 curves across the ridgetop, its tail coiling in a tight spiral at one end, its open mouth apparently engulfing or disgorging an oval form at the other end. From the ground, standing beside it, the Serpent Mound is not spectacular. You can see sections of it, the curving earthen ridge rising 2 to 3 feet above the surrounding surface. The undulations of the body suggesting motion, but you cannot take in the whole. It was designed to be perceived from above, to be seen as a whole, as a single image rather than as a series of earthen ridges. And from above, it is breathtaking. The entirety of the serpent, 1,300 feet of undulating form, becomes visible as a unified image of extraordinary power and grace. The oval in the open mouth becomes ambiguous and rich with possible meanings. It could be an egg. It could be the sun. It could be the frog that some traditions associate with serpent effigy mounds. The coiling tail suggests energy and potential, the serpent about to move or just having moved. The Serpent Mound has been dated through various methods, including optically stimulated luminescence, to roughly 1,000 years ago, placing it in the Mississippian period, though there is also evidence that an earlier Hopewell phase mound may have preceded it at the same location. The astronomical alignments of the mound are complex and not fully resolved, but multiple researchers have noted that the open mouth of the serpent aligns with the sunset at the summer solstice, suggesting a connection to solar observation that is consistent with what we know of other Mississippian ceremonial sites. The significance of serpents in Eastern North American indigenous cosmology is deep and complex. Serpents were associated with the lower world, with water, with the underworld powers that were counterbalanced against the upper world powers associated with birds and sky. The great horned serpent of Eastern woodland cosmology was one of the most powerful beings in the lower world, a creature of enormous power that could be an ally or a threat to human communities, depending on the nature of the relationship maintained with it. To build an effigy of that being on a ridgetop, 1,300 feet of earth and serpent looking out over the valley below, was an act of spiritual and political significance that we can only partially reconstruct. But the act itself is legible. It says that the people who built it understood the relationship between the human world and the powers that surround it with a seriousness and a sophistication that demanded expression at a scale commensurate with the vision. 1,300 feet of undulating earth and serpent on a ridgetop in Ohio. That is what taking your relationship to the cosmos seriously looks like when it is expressed in earth. And then there is the question of what it means to stand in a place like the Serpent Mound, or beside Monk's Mound at Cahokia, or in the canyon at Chaco, or in the Octagon at Newark, and to know what you're looking at. Most people who visit these places do not know what they are looking at. They know they are looking at something old. They may know they are looking at something built by Native Americans. But they do not know, because they were never taught, that they are standing in the remains of cities that were once among the largest in the world, in the ruins of astronomical observatories of extraordinary precision, at the center of trade networks that once spanned the continent. They do not know because the history was not taught to them. And the history was not taught to them because teaching it would have complicated the story that the institutions of American education and American culture found it convenient to tell. That is a form of theft. Taking from people the knowledge of the world they live in, the knowledge of the history of the ground beneath their feet, is a form of theft. It is smaller certainly than the theft of land and life and liberty that the colonial encounter imposed on the peoples of this continent, but it is a real impoverishment. It makes people less than they could be. It makes the culture shallower than it deserves to be. It makes the country less than the full measure of the history it contains. The alternative is to know, to learn the names of the places and the peoples, to understand that the mound on the edge of town is not a curiosity, but a monument, the physical expression of a vision of the cosmos and a set of values about what human beings owe each other and owe the world they inhabit. To understand that the straight lines visible in certain Google Earth views of the Ohio and Mississippi valleys are the remains of road systems and earthwork complexes that once organized the landscape as deliberately as any modern highway system. To understand that the pottery in the museum cases and the copper ornaments and the shell gorgets were not made by primitives, but by artists of genuine sophistication, expressing a cosmological vision of genuine complexity. To know all of this does not require feeling guilty about being who you are or living where you live. It requires only the honesty to look at what is actually here, the intellectual generosity to recognize achievement when it is present, regardless of whose achievement it is, and the moral seriousness to acknowledge that the history of this place is more complicated and more demanding than the comfortable version allows. The night is very late now. The questions have been laid out and cannot be quickly answered or easily set aside. The mounds are still there, still rising in the pre-dawn darkness across the river valleys of the continent. The canyon walls are still standing in the desert, still holding in their precisely laid stones the record of a people who took the cosmos seriously enough to encode it in architecture. The earthworks are still there, still preserving in their geometry the astronomical knowledge of a civilization that paid careful attention to the movements of the moon across its 18-year cycle, and found in those movements a meaning worth commemorating in 50 acres of precisely arranged earth. And the peoples who built these things, and whose descendants have maintained the thread of connection through everything that has been done to break it, are still there, still living on lands that their ancestors shaped and managed, still performing ceremonies whose roots reach back to the civilizations this story has been describing, still speaking languages that encode knowledge systems of extraordinary depth and sophistication, still insisting generation after generation on the reality of a history that the dominant culture has preferred to ignore or dismiss. They were right to insist. The history is real. The civilizations were real. The knowledge is real. The continuity is real. And now perhaps a few more people know it. That is not a small thing. History does not change because a few more people know its truth. But consciousness does, understanding does. And from understanding, over time, with enough people and enough will, the other changes become possible. The cities that were here before America were not footnotes. They were not curiosities. They were not the scattered traces of primitive peoples who had not yet learned to build anything worth building. They were cities, real, complex, populous, sophisticated urban centers built by peoples who understood their world deeply and expressed that understanding in architecture and astronomy and art and social organization of a quality that belongs without qualification in any honest account of what human beings have achieved on this earth. That is the truth. That is the version the textbooks left out. And that is the version at last that you now carry with you into whatever morning comes after this long night. Rest now. The history will keep. And tomorrow, when you look at the landscape around you, perhaps you will see it a little differently. You will wonder just a little what it looked like before. What stood here? Who walked here? What they built, and what they knew, and what they hoped for. And perhaps that wondering is enough. Perhaps that wondering is where all of it begins. The curiosity that refuses to accept the simplified version. The instinct that says there is more to this story. The sense that the land beneath your feet is older than the history books acknowledge, and that its history matters, and that the people who made it are worth knowing and worth remembering and worth honoring with the simple act of understanding who they were. They were extraordinary. This continent is full of the evidence of their extraordinary achievements. And now you know it. Good night. There are stories embedded in the oral traditions of the peoples we have been discussing tonight that deserve to be heard on their own terms, not only as corroborating evidence for archaeological findings or as illustrations of points made by Western scholars, but as complete and authoritative accounts of the past in their own right. The oral tradition is not a lesser form of historical knowledge than the written record. It is a different form with different strengths and different limitations. Where written records can preserve specific details with precision, oral traditions can preserve the emotional and moral weight of events in ways that written records rarely achieve. Where written records can be altered by the person who writes them down, oral traditions are checked by the community that maintains them, challenged by anyone who remembers it differently, corrected and refined through the process of communal transmission. And where written records depend on the survival of the physical material on which they are inscribed, oral traditions travel in the bodies of the people who carry them, surviving fires and floods and conquest as long as any of those people survive to pass them on. There is a tradition among the Hopi people of the American Southwest that describes the world as having passed through several previous creations, each of which reached a point of imbalance and was ended to make way for the next. The world we currently inhabit is one of these creations, the fourth world in the Hopi accounting, and it is subject to the same risks and the same possibilities of imbalance as the worlds that came before. The story describes what the previous worlds looked like, why they ended, what the survivors carried forward, and what the obligations are of the people living in the current world. This is not a fairy tale. It is a sophisticated cosmological framework that encodes ecological and social wisdom accumulated over thousands of years. The description of previous worlds ending because of imbalance, because people forgot their responsibilities to each other and to the living world around them, is not simply religious mythology. It is a mnemonic device for preserving and transmitting the lessons that the community had learned about the conditions that lead to social and environmental collapse. The Haudenosaunee tradition of the Great Law of Peace describes the founding of the Iroquois Confederacy through the work of the peacemaker, a man of extraordinary vision who traveled among the warring nations of the Northeast and convinced them to put down their weapons and join together under a common constitution. The Great Law, as maintained in the oral tradition and in the wampum belts that encode its provisions, describes in considerable detail the structure of the Confederacy, the rights and responsibilities of its member nations, the procedures for making collective decisions, and the mechanisms for resolving conflicts within the alliance. The Great Law is a constitutional document of genuine sophistication. It addresses questions of federalism, of individual rights within a collective framework, of the processes for peaceful resolution of disputes that go to the heart of political philosophy. And it was maintained and transmitted in oral form through the recitation of trained speakers at council meetings, for generations before European contact and for centuries after. The Lakota tradition of the white buffalo calf woman describes the coming of the sacred pipe and the 7 sacred rites that define Lakota's ceremonial life. This tradition is not simply a religious origin story. It is a comprehensive account of the values and the practices that organize Lakota's social and spiritual life, transmitted in a narrative form that makes it memorable and that embeds the practices in a story of origin that gives them authority and meaning. These traditions are alive. They are being recited and transmitted in Hopi and Haudenosaunee and Lakota communities today. They are being recorded and studied by scholars who recognize their significance as historical documents, as well as living spiritual and philosophical frameworks. And they're being maintained and transmitted by the communities themselves as essential parts of the cultural inheritance that connects living people to their ancestors and to the land that those ancestors inhabited and shaped. The landscape itself is a text. This is one of the most important ideas in the study of indigenous North American cultures, and one that is still only partially understood by the Western scholarly tradition that has been trying to read it. Place names are one of the most dense concentrations of historical information in any culture's archive. The names that indigenous peoples gave to the places in their territories were not arbitrary labels. They were descriptions. They encoded information about the physical characteristics of the place, about the events that had occurred there, about the species that lived there, about the appropriate human behavior in that place, about the spiritual significance of the location, about the history of the community's relationship with it. A place name like the Lakota name for the Black Hills, Pahasapa, means more than simply the hills that are black. It encodes a relationship, a sense of the sacred significance of the place, a claim of belonging that goes beyond simple geographic description. The Black Hills are the center of the Lakota world in a cosmological sense, not simply a geographic feature of the landscape. The name carries that meaning, and every time it is spoken by a Lakota person, that meaning is present. When Europeans renamed the places of North America, they did not simply replace labels with other labels. They replaced text with descriptions. They replaced complex, historically and spiritually dense accounts of places and human relationships to them with functional identifiers that conveyed only location. And in doing so, they erased from the landscape one of the most comprehensive archives of pre-contact history that existed. Not entirely. The indigenous place names survive in the communities of the peoples who created them, transmitted in oral tradition and in the oral usage of those communities, and increasingly in written form as language revitalization programs document and teach them. And some indigenous place names survive in corrupted or anglicized form in the official geographic nomenclature of the United States and Canada, preserving traces of the original language even in the absence of the full meaning. The name Mississippi, for example, is derived from the Ojibwe or a closely related language, meaning something like Great River or Father of Waters. The name Chicago comes from a word in the Miami, Illinois language that referred to the wild garlic or onion that grew in the area. The name Connecticut is derived from an Algonquian word meaning at the long tidal estuary. The name Massachusetts comes from the name of the people who lived in the area, meaning at the Great Hill or near the Great Hills. These names are fossils of the original linguistic landscape of North America, preserved in a form that has lost most of its meaning, but that retains the form of the original words. Recovering their meaning requires knowing the language from which they came, knowing the landscape to which they referred, and knowing the cultural context in which the names were created and used. That recovery is possible, at least partially, and it is happening. Indigenous language scholars working with community members and with academic linguists are recovering the meanings of these fossilized place names, and using that recovery to reconstruct aspects of the pre-contact landscape and the relationships between human communities and the places they inhabited. Let us spend some time with a subject that tends to be treated in a shallow way in popular accounts of indigenous North American civilization, but that is in fact one of the richest and most complex aspects of these cultures, the ceremonial systems. Every complex human society develops ritual practices that mark the significant transitions in individual and social life, that maintain the community's relationship to the cosmos, that honor the dead, that celebrate the productive season, that renew the social bonds that hold the community together. These practices are sometimes called religion, though that word carries so many Western connotations about individual belief and institutional authority that it is often a poor fit for the ceremonial systems of indigenous peoples. A better description might be that these practices are the community's ongoing conversation with the world it inhabits, a conversation in which the human community affirms its place in the web of relationships that sustains all life, renews its obligations to the beings that share the world with it, and maintains the conditions that make continued flourishing possible. The annual ceremonial calendars of the Pueblo peoples of the American Southwest are among the most elaborate and sophisticated examples of this kind of practice anywhere in the world. The Hopi ceremonial calendar, for example, organizes the entire year into a sequence of ceremonies whose timing is determined by the astronomical calendar, with each ceremony associated with specific obligations, specific preparations, specific songs and dances and prayers and material objects, and specific relationships to the agricultural cycle, the natural world, and the spiritual beings that govern the Hopi cosmos. The Kachina ceremonies of the Hopi and related Pueblo peoples are the most visible expression of this ceremonial system. The Kachinas are spiritual beings who embody specific aspects of the natural and supernatural world, and who visit the human world during the first half of the ceremonial year to bring rain, fertility, and good fortune. They are represented in ceremonial dances by masked performers who literally embody the Kachina during the ceremony, and by the carved wooden figures that Hopi artists create to teach children about the spiritual beings and their attributes. The Kachina tradition is often reduced in popular culture to the carved wooden dolls that have become collectible art objects. But the carved figures are only the surface expression of a ceremonial system of extraordinary depth and complexity, a system that connects Hopi people to their ancestors, to the natural world, to the spiritual dimensions of the cosmos, and to each other through shared participation in a cycle of ceremonies that organizes the entire year and gives it meaning and structure. Similar ceremonial systems, organized around the agricultural and astronomical calendar, around the relationships between human communities and the spiritual powers of the natural world, around the obligations of the living to the dead and to the unborn, around the maintenance of the social bonds that hold the community together, can be found in cultures across the continent. Each is distinct. Each reflects the specific environment, the specific history, and the specific values of the people who maintain it. Each is a complete and sophisticated system for organizing human life and maintaining human relationship to the world. And each is threatened by the same forces that have threatened every aspect of indigenous North American cultural life for 5 centuries. The disruption of communities, the loss of the elders who carry the knowledge, the economic pressures that make traditional life increasingly difficult to maintain, and the ongoing effects of policies that for generations actively discouraged or prohibited traditional practice. But each is also being maintained, recovered, renewed. The ceremonial calendars of the Pueblo peoples continue to organize the year in the villages of New Mexico and Arizona. The potlatch ceremonies of the Northwest Coast peoples continue in coastal British Columbia and Washington and Alaska. The sun dance continues on the Great Plains. The green corn ceremony continues in the Southeast. The midwinter ceremonies of the Haudenosaunee continue in New York and Ontario. These are not museum pieces. They are living practices maintained by living communities, serving the same functions they have always served, connecting people to each other, to their ancestors, to the natural world, and to the spiritual dimensions of existence. The rivers knew before anyone else did. This is not a poetic statement. It is, in a specific and practical sense, literally true. The rivers of North America carry in their chemistry and their sediment loads the record of what human beings have done in the watersheds they drain, going back thousands of years. The analysis of river sediment can detect periods of intensive agriculture, of forest clearing, of erosion caused by human land use, in the layers of sediment that accumulated on river floors, and in the delta environments where rivers meet the sea or the lake. And what the rivers tell us, consistently and across the continent, is that human beings were active and intensive users of the North American landscape for far longer, and at far larger scales than the conventional historical narrative acknowledges. The rivers of the Ohio and Mississippi valleys carry the chemical signature of the agricultural intensification that accompanied the rise of the Mississippian tradition, the sudden increase in erosion that followed the clearing of forest for maize agriculture, the chemical signature of phosphorus-enriched runoff from heavily inhabited and intensively cultivated areas. And they carry the signature of what happened after the population collapsed, the gradual decrease in erosion rates, the chemical changes that indicate the return of forests to previously cultivated areas, the slow ecological recovery of landscapes that had been intensively managed and then abruptly abandoned. The rivers of the Pacific Northwest carry the signature of the salmon management practices of the peoples of those watersheds, the evidence of weirs and traps, and the patterns of selective harvest that maintain the salmon runs. And they carry the signature of what happened when those management practices were disrupted, the ecological changes that followed the removal of the people who had maintained the rivers and the species they sustained. The rivers of the Southwest carry the signature of the irrigation systems of the Hohokam, who built one of the most extensive canal systems in pre-industrial North America, moving Colorado River water through hundreds of miles of engineered channels to irrigate the desert floor of what is now the Phoenix Basin. The Hohokam Canal system, at its peak, irrigated an area of perhaps 100,000 acres, supporting a population of some 40 to 80,000 people in what would otherwise have been an almost uninhabitable desert. The remnants of those canals are still detectable in the soils and the satellite images of the Phoenix metropolitan area. The modern city of Phoenix was built on the site of the Hohokam civilization, and the modern city's water infrastructure traces, with some modifications, the routes that the Hohokam engineers laid out 1,000 years ago. The modern city is in a very real sense built on the foundations that those engineers created. This is not a metaphor, though it works as one. The physical infrastructure of North American civilization is in many places built literally on the infrastructure of the pre-contact world that preceded it. The agricultural landscapes of the Midwest were cultivated before European contact and remain, in modified form, agricultural landscapes today. The trade routes that connected pre-contact communities became colonial trade routes and then highways. The sites of the great pre-contact centers became in many cases the sites of the major cities that followed. The continuity is not only cultural and demographic. It is physical. The landscape of North America today is in large part the product of the pre-contact landscape management systems that shaped it over thousands of years, combined with the dramatic and often destructive transformations of the colonial and industrial periods. Understanding that continuity is part of understanding where we are. Understanding where we are is part of understanding what we might do differently. We have spent a great deal of this night talking about specific places and specific civilizations and specific achievements. But there is a larger pattern underlying all of it that deserves to be articulated directly before we come to the close of this journey. The pattern is this: the pre-contact civilizations of North America were not simpler, more primitive versions of the cultures that replaced them. They were genuinely, fundamentally different from European civilization in their basic assumptions about the relationship between human beings and the natural world, between individuals and communities, between the present generation and the generations that came before and will come after. And those differences were not failures to achieve the European model. They were deliberate choices, the products of long experience and accumulated wisdom about what kinds of civilization are actually sustainable in the long run. The European civilizations that arrived in North America in the 16th and 17th centuries were at that moment in history extraordinarily dynamic and expansive. They had developed technologies of navigation, of military organization, of disease resistance, and of economic organization that made them capable of projecting power across the globe in ways that had no precedent. By the measure of expansionary capacity, they were unmatched. but by other measures, measures that are becoming increasingly relevant to the survival of complex civilization in the 21st century, they were, and we are, far less impressive. The ecological damage that industrial civilization has inflicted on the natural systems that sustain all human life represents a failure of the relationship between human civilization and the natural world that is by any long-term measure catastrophic. The inequality that marks modern industrial societies, the extremity of the distance between the wealthy and the poor, represents a failure of social organization that indigenous social systems were in many cases specifically designed to prevent. The disconnection of urban populations from the ecological systems that sustain them, the ignorance of where food comes from and how ecosystems work, and what the obligations of humans to the natural world actually are, represents a failure of knowledge transmission that the sophisticated oral and ceremonial traditions of indigenous cultures were specifically designed to prevent. We are not simply more advanced versions of the civilizations that preceded us on this continent. We are in important respects less wise, less sustainable, and less adequately equipped for the long-term challenges of maintaining complex civilization on a finite planet. That is not a comfortable thing to say, but the evidence supports it, and the evidence has been here in the soil chemistry and the sediment records and the oral traditions and the living ecological systems all along. The peoples who built the mounds and the great houses and the earthworks and the ceremonial systems were trying to do something very specific. They were trying to build civilizations that could last. And by the measure that matters most, which is how long they were actually sustained in productive and largely non-destructive relationship with the landscapes they inhabited, they succeeded far better than we have. That is the final lesson of this long night's journey. Not that the pre-contact civilizations of North America were perfect, or without conflict, or without their own forms of violence and inequality and environmental impact. They were not. They were human civilizations with all the complexity and contradiction that implies. But they had in many cases figured out things that we have not about how to live in sustainable relationship with the natural world, about how to organize social life around principles of reciprocity and collective well-being, about how to transmit knowledge across generations in forms that remain robust and relevant, about how to maintain conscious relationship to the temporal cycles and the ecological processes that govern the conditions for human flourishing. Those things are not lost. They are in the living traditions of the peoples who are the descendants of those civilizations. They are in the soil and the rivers and the ecological systems that those civilizations shaped. They are in the oral traditions and the ceremonies and the languages that have survived 5 centuries of assault. And they are increasingly in the broader conversation about how human civilization might navigate the challenges of the 21st century without destroying the planetary systems on which all human life depends. The mounds are speaking, the canyon walls are speaking, the rivers are speaking, the peoples who built and maintained and are descended from these extraordinary civilizations are speaking. The question at the end of this long night is whether we are finally ready to listen. And now the sky is beginning to lighten at its edges. Not yet dawn, but the deep darkness is softening. And somewhere outside the window where you are listening, the first birds are beginning to stir. You have traveled a long way tonight through 10,000 years of human presence on a continent that most Americans know only in the last 500 years of its history. Through the cities and the earthworks and the trade networks and the ceremonial systems and the ecological knowledge and the social wisdom and the astronomical understanding of a civilization, or rather dozens of distinct civilizations that were in every meaningful sense as sophisticated and as valuable as any that existed anywhere on Earth at the same moment in time. You have heard about the catastrophe, the epidemic diseases that moved ahead of the colonizers, killing millions before any European explorer arrived to describe what he saw. The military violence, the political destruction, the cultural suppression, the deliberate erasure of language and ceremony and the knowledge that language and ceremony carried. The lie of the empty land that was used to justify taking what was not empty and was not available. And you have heard about the survival, the peoples who are still here, the traditions that were maintained through everything that was done to end them, the languages that are being revitalized, the ceremonies that are being renewed, the knowledge that is being recovered and taught and offered to a world that needs it. The insistence generation after generation on the reality of a history that the dominant culture has preferred to forget. That survival is one of the most extraordinary stories in human history. Not because it is comfortable or easy or without tremendous ongoing cost, but because it demonstrates something important about the resilience of human cultures that have deep roots, that have been maintained through long practice and strong transmission, that are embedded in relationships to place and to each other that are not easily severed even by the most determined and sustained assault. The pre-contact civilizations of North America are not over. They are not in the past. They are present. They are alive. They are carried by the peoples who are their descendants and who maintain in living form the traditions and the knowledge and the relationships to place that connect the present to the extraordinary past that this night has been exploring. That is the truth. That is the complete truth as best as it can be told in a single long night. The version that the textbooks left out. The version that the ground has always known. The version that the peoples who are here have always known and have never stopped trying to tell. And now you know it too. Go gently into the rest of this night. Let the images settle. Let the weight of 10,000 years of human achievement and human resilience and human loss find its place in whatever understanding you carry of where you live and who was here before you, and what they built and what it means. The mounds are still rising in the river valleys. The canyon walls are still standing in the desert. The earthworks are still mapping the lunar cycle in the fields of Ohio. The salmon are still running in the northwest rivers, though in numbers that would break the hearts of the people who once managed them so carefully. The ceremonies are still being performed. The languages are still being spoken. The peoples are still here. They were always here. And now, at last, rest now. Sleep well. The history will be here when you wake. It has been here for 10,000 years. It will be here for whatever comes after. Good night. Before we close, there is one more thread worth pulling because it connects everything we have discussed tonight to a question that is neither historical nor archaeological, but entirely immediate. What does it mean to live on land that someone else made? Not in the legal or political sense, though those questions are real and pressing and unresolved, but in the deeper, more personal sense. What does it mean for ordinary people going about their ordinary lives to inhabit a landscape that was shaped by the intelligence and the labor and the love of people whose descendants are still alive and whose claims are still, in every moral sense, intact? Most people do not think about this. The landscape around them feels natural, fixed, simply given. The fields and the forests and the rivers exist, and they have always existed roughly as they now appear. And the houses and the roads and the towns were built by the people who built them within living or recorded memory. And that is the full extent of the inhabited world. But beneath that inhabited world, in the soil and the sediment and the landscape forms that have been shaped over millennia, there is another history. A history of deliberate human action, of accumulated knowledge and patient labor, of civilizations that understood this land in ways that we are only beginning to recover. You cannot undo that history. You cannot restore what was lost. Not fully, not in any single generation, perhaps not in any number of generations. What happened happened. The epidemic diseases came. The military violence came. The cultural suppression came. The deliberate erasure came. And what was destroyed cannot simply be reconstructed through an act of will, however good that will might be. But you can know. That is always possible. You can learn the name of the land you stand on in the language of the people who lived there before you. You can learn what kind of civilization made that land what it was. You can learn whose descendants are still living and what their current circumstances are and what they are trying to maintain and recover. You can support those efforts in the limited ways that are available to people who are not themselves members of those communities. You can insist that the history be taught accurately to your children in the schools they attend, in the communities you are part of. None of this is a complete answer. None of it resolves the enormous injustices that are still alive and present. The land claims, the treaty rights, the sovereignty questions, the intergenerational trauma of the boarding schools, the ongoing effects of poverty and marginalization in communities whose resources were systematically stripped over generations. These are not historical problems. They are present-day problems requiring present-day solutions. And those solutions will require political will and legal change and material resources at a scale that goes far beyond individual awareness. But awareness is where everything else begins. And the awareness that this night has been trying to build is not only awareness of the facts of history, of the populations in the cities and the trade networks and the mounds. It is awareness of the weight of the history, the sense that the ground beneath your feet is not simply a neutral substrate, but a palimpsest, layer on layer of human presence and human achievement and human loss going back far further than the comfortable story suggests. That weight is real. Feeling it is not a burden. It is an enrichment. It is the difference between living in a place and knowing the place you live in. And there is finally a word that has been running through this entire narrative, sometimes spoken and sometimes implied, that deserves to be addressed directly. The word is mystery. The pre-Columbian civilizations of North America are often described, particularly in popular culture and in the kind of alternative history media that fills YouTube and podcasts and bestseller lists, as mysterious. The lost cities, the vanished peoples, the unexplained mounds, the enigmatic alignments, the unknown builders. But they are not mysterious, not genuinely, not in the sense of being beyond understanding or beyond the reach of honest scholarship. They are unknown to most people, which is not the same thing as mysterious. They have been hidden by deliberate acts of omission and erasure and misdirection from the mainstream of American historical consciousness. But they are not unknowable. The archaeological record is extensive and growing. The oral traditions of descendant peoples are rich and specific. The scientific tools available to researchers, from LIDAR to DNA analysis to isotope chemistry to satellite imagery, are revealing the pre-contact world in more detail and with more accuracy every year. The mystery, to the extent that there is one, is not in the past. It is in the present. The mystery is why the story of these extraordinary civilizations has been so effectively suppressed for so long in a country that prides itself on its commitment to truth and to the free flow of information. The mystery is why the mounds and the earthworks and the great houses are not as well known as the pyramids of Egypt or the temples of Greece, not as celebrated, not as much a part of the common stock of cultural reference that educated people share. The answer, of course, is not actually mysterious. The answer is politics. The story of the pre-contact civilizations of North America is a politically inconvenient story. It complicates the founding mythology of the United States. It supports the claims of peoples whose political and legal standing the U.S. government has historically preferred to minimize. It raises questions about the moral foundations of the national project that many people find uncomfortable to confront. So the story was suppressed not by a single deliberate conspiracy, but by 1,000 small acts of omission and misdirection, by textbook decisions and museum curation choices and popular culture narratives that found it easier and more convenient to tell a simpler story. A story of empty land and primitive peoples and the civilizing arrival of European settlement. That story is over. Not because the political inconveniences have been resolved, because they have not, but because the evidence has accumulated past the point where it can be plausibly ignored, because the descendant communities have become vocal and visible enough that their history cannot be dismissed, and because a growing number of people in the academy and outside it are determined that the full story will be told. This is one telling, one night's journey through a history that deserves a lifetime of study. One attempt to give weight and substance to civilizations that most people who live on the land those civilizations built have never been asked to think about. It is not enough, but it is a beginning. And beginnings in the end are what history is made of. The beginning of the world in every cosmological tradition, the beginning of each new human life, the beginning of each civilization, the beginning perhaps of a new relationship between the country that calls itself America and the full, complicated, extraordinary history of the land it inhabits. The mounds are still there, rising in the morning light, as they have risen for 1,000 years, shaped by the hands of people who wanted to build something that the earth would remember. The earth has remembered. Now you remember too. Good night. Good morning. Rest well. There is one last thing to hold in the mind before sleep comes. The people who built these civilizations were not trying to leave a legacy for us to study. They were not building mounds so that archaeologists could measure them, or tourists could photograph them, or documentarians could make videos about them. They were building for their own reasons, to honor powers they believed in, to mark places that mattered to them, to express their understanding of a cosmos they took seriously, to create spaces where the community could come together and renew the bonds that held it. The fact that we can study those mounds now, the fact that they have survived long enough to become the subjects of our inquiry and our amazement, is a kind of accident. A beautiful accident, but an accident. The mounds were not made for us. They were made by people who had no way of knowing we would ever exist. And yet here we are, standing at the edge of what they built, trying to understand who they were and what they were trying to do, and what it meant to them and what it might mean to us. That effort of understanding, reaching across the centuries to try to comprehend a world that was different from ours in many of its fundamental assumptions, is one of the more extraordinary things that human beings do. It is one of the things that makes history worth studying rather than simply leaving the past in the past. Because understanding the past changes the present, not by determining what the present must be, but by expanding the range of what we understand to be possible. When you know that a civilization maintained itself for centuries in sustainable relationship with its environment, that knowledge expands your sense of what sustainable civilization might look like. When you know that people organize complex political systems around principles of collective decision-making and respect for individual sovereignty, that knowledge expands your sense of what political organization might look like. When you know that peoples maintained vast bodies of ecological and astronomical knowledge across generations through oral tradition and ceremonial practice, that knowledge expands your sense of what knowledge transmission might look like. The pre-contact civilizations of North America are not just history. They are a set of existence proofs, demonstrations that certain things are possible for human beings to achieve. Things that our civilization has not achieved. Things that we might want to achieve. Things that, if we are honest about the challenges facing complex civilization in the 21st century, we may actually need to achieve if any version of complex civilization is to remain possible in the centuries after. The knowledge is here in the ground, and in the oral traditions, and in the living communities, and in the scholarship that is finally beginning to do justice to what the evidence shows. And the people who hold that knowledge, who are its living custodians and whose ancestors created it over thousands of years, are here as well. The rest is up to us, to receive what is being offered, to learn what can be learned, to support what needs to be supported, to change what needs to be changed in ourselves and in the institutions and in the story that we tell about who we are and where we come from and what we owe to the world we inhabit. That is a large task, large enough to last a lifetime, large enough maybe to give a lifetime meaning. But for tonight, it is enough to have come this far, to have heard the true account, to have let the weight of it settle into whatever understanding you carry when you finally close your eyes and let the night do what the night does. Sleep is its own kind of time travel. Every night you close your eyes on one day and open them on another. And the world has continued in its turning, and the light has moved. And somewhere in the river valleys of the Midwest, the mounds are still rising from the earth. And somewhere in the canyon walls of the southwest, the great houses are still standing. And somewhere in the living communities of the peoples who built them and are descended from them, a language is being spoken, and a ceremony is being performed, and a tradition is being maintained, and a connection to the deep past of this extraordinary continent is being kept alive for one more generation. Good night. The history will still be here when you wake. There are things the darkness knows that the daylight cannot quite hold. The sense of how old the world is. The sense of how many people have lived in a place before you. The sense of how briefly any one civilization occupies the long arc of the story. The sense that the story is not yours alone, that you entered it in the middle and you will leave it in the middle, and it will continue without you in ways that you cannot predict or control. That is not a frightening thought at this hour. It is a releasing one. The weight of the history you have heard tonight does not have to be carried into tomorrow as obligation alone. It can be carried as the gift of a world that turns out to be far more inhabited, far more storied, far more full of human achievement and human wisdom than you were ever told. The people who built the mounds and the great houses and the earthworks and the trade networks and the ceremonial systems were in the end doing what all human beings do. They were trying to make sense of the world they found themselves in. They were trying to build something that would outlast them. They were trying to understand how to live well, how to treat each other justly, how to maintain the conditions that make life good, not just for themselves but for the generations that would come after them. In those ambitions, they were exactly like us. In some of their achievements toward those ends, they were considerably more successful than we have been. And in their persistence, in the survival of their descendants and their traditions through 5 centuries of assault, they have demonstrated something about the resilience of cultures that are deeply rooted, that are embedded in relationships of long-standing to place and to each other that deserve more than our admiration. They deserve our attention, our learning, our support where it is appropriate and wanted, and our honesty about the history that made the world we have inherited. That honesty begins with knowing, and now you know a little more than you did when the night began. That is enough. That is more than enough. Good night. The stars above you, if you can see them through whatever window looks out on the night where you are the same stars that the builders of Cahokia watched through their winter skies. The same stars that the Chacoan astronomers aligned their doorways to receive. The same stars that burned over the Newark earthworks on the nights when the moon rose precisely where the octagon's geometry predicted it would rise. The same stars that lit the faces of the Hopewell artists as they worked their copper and their mica and their obsidian into the objects that would accompany the dead into whatever came after. The same stars still there, still turning, and the earth below, wherever you lie down to sleep, is connected to the earth where the mounds are rising and the canyon walls are standing and the rivers are carrying their freight of memory toward the sea. You are not separate from that. Also, like and subscribe to my channel. Ancient Tales Sleep. Good night, sweet dreams.